The world of Pokémon is larger than most people realize, and most of it is very, very quiet. There are numbers behind every creature, dates behind every decision, and an enormous amount of perfectly unremarkable information waiting patiently in the margins of one of the most documented franchises in entertainment history. And before you drift any further, settle in as we begin tonight's relaxing journey through the world of Pokémon. If this helps you unwind, subscribe to join the Cozy Club. The franchise that would become Pokémon did not begin with a game. It began with a concept, and that concept sat in various stages of development for approximately 6 years before it reached players. The original project, which carried the working title Capsule Monsters before trademark complications required a change, was conceived in the late 1980s and involved an enormous amount of procedural work before a single line of game code was finalized. The name Capsule Monsters was eventually set aside in favor of Pocket Monsters, which was then abbreviated to Pokémon for international markets. That abbreviation required its own set of trademark filings, which were submitted across multiple territories at different points during the mid-1990s. Each territory required its own documentation, its own processing period, and its own administrative correspondence. The original Pocket Monsters Red and Green were released in Japan on February 27, 1996. That specific date has since become a recognized anniversary within the franchise, observed annually with various promotional events and content releases. The date falls in late winter in Japan, during a period when the climate in most regions is cold and relatively still. Red and Green were not released simultaneously in all regions. The international rollout of the original games unfolded across a period of approximately 2.5 years. Pokémon Red and Blue arrived in North America on September the 28th, 1998, which was approximately 2 years and 7 months after the original Japanese launch. The Australian release followed in October of 1998. The European release arrived in October of 1999, extending the rollout period considerably. The original games were developed for the Nintendo Game Boy, a handheld device that had been on the market since 1989. The Game Boy's screen was a monochrome liquid crystal display capable of displaying 4 shades of gray. The resolution of that screen was 160 pixels wide by 144 pixels tall. Every sprite in the original Pokémon games was designed to be legible within those constraints. The original 151 Pokémon were each represented by a front-facing sprite and a back-facing sprite for use during battle sequences. The front sprite appeared when the opposing Pokémon was displayed, and the back sprite appeared when the player's own Pokémon was shown attacking. Each sprite occupied a fixed grid of pixels, and the design of each creature had to work clearly within that grid at the screen's native resolution. The original sprite artwork for the Japanese Red and Green versions was replaced entirely for the international Blue version, which used revised sprites that many players and commentators have since described as more polished or more anatomically consistent. The sprite revisions were done by a small team working within the same pixel constraints, adjusting proportions and shading to produce a cleaner presentation across the full roster of 151 creatures. The total number of Pokémon in the original roster was 151, though one of those, the creature known as Mew, was not obtainable through normal gameplay and was not listed in the in-game encyclopedia at the time of launch. Mew was added to the game data late in development, reportedly inserted into unused memory space by programmer Shigeki Morimoto. The existence of Mew was not publicly acknowledged through official channels at launch and became known primarily through the distribution of event cartridges and promotional giveaways in Japan. The in-game encyclopedia, known as the Pokédex, was designed to register entries as players caught or received each Pokémon. An entry was added for each creature, describing its physical characteristics and behavior in text of approximately 2 to 4 sentences per species. These entries were written to give the impression of scientific documentation, referencing height and weight measurements alongside behavioral observations. The height and weight figures listed in the Pokédex were presented in both metric and imperial units across different regional versions of the games. The conversion between measurement systems was handled differently in different versions, and some values differ slightly between regional releases due to rounding conventions applied during the conversion process. The height of Pikachu, for instance, is listed as approximately 40 centimeters in the metric presentation, which converts to approximately 1 foot 4 inches in the imperial version. The weight of the heaviest Pokémon in the original games, a creature known as Snorlax, was listed at approximately 460 kilograms in the original Japanese data. That value converts to approximately 1,014 pounds in imperial units. Snorlax's Pokédex entry describes it as spending most of its time eating and sleeping, which is a gentle observation about a creature that was designed to serve a specific narrative function in the games, appearing twice to block a path until moved by a particular item. The item required to wake a sleeping Snorlax in the original games was called the Poké Flute, a musical instrument obtained from a character named Mr. Fuji following the completion of a specific quest in the town of Lavender. The Poké Flute had no battle function. Its sole purpose in the game was to trigger the encounter with Snorlax at 2 specific locations on the overworld map. Once obtained, the item remained in the player's bag for the remainder of the game without any additional use cases. The 2 locations where Snorlax appeared in the original games were along routes 12 and 16, both of which connected areas of the game world that the player could not access until the obstruction was removed. The design choice to place a large sleeping creature blocking a path was a narrative device used to gate access to new areas of the map without requiring an artificial barrier like a locked door or a guard refusing passage. The creature simply sat there, asleep, until disturbed. Lavender Town, the location where Mr. Fuji lived, was a small settlement in the original game world situated in the northeastern portion of the map. The town contained a tower associated with deceased Pokémon, and its background music was a simple looping composition in a minor key. The piece was constructed from a limited number of audio channels, as the Game Boy's sound hardware supported only 4 simultaneous audio channels, 3 of which produced tonal sounds and 1 of which produced noise. The audio hardware of the original Game Boy used pulse wave channels to generate its primary musical tones. The pitch and timbre of sounds produced by this hardware were determined by the frequency and duty cycle settings applied to each channel. The composers working on Pokémon Red and Green, primarily Junichi Masuda, worked within these constraints to produce a complete musical score covering all towns, routes, battles, and cutscene events in the game. Junichi Masuda composed the original soundtrack for Pokémon Red and Green and has remained with Game Freak across subsequent decades, eventually taking on roles in game direction and company leadership. The original score contained dozens of individual compositions, each looping seamlessly during gameplay. The compositions were structured to loop without an obvious restart point, a technique that allowed the music to continue indefinitely without the player noticing a seam. Though individual musical themes in Pokémon games have remained consistent in certain respects across multiple generations, the battle theme structure, for instance, follows a general arc of tension and resolution that has been maintained across many sequels and remakes, updated with new instrumentation and arrangement, but retaining recognizable structural elements. The theme associated with wild Pokémon encounters follows a different arc from the theme associated with trainer battles, with the trainer battle theme typically beginning at a higher energy level. The shift from Game Boy hardware to the Game Boy Color introduced expanded color palettes to the Pokémon franchise. Pokémon Gold and Silver, released in Japan on November 21st, 1999, were developed specifically for the Game Boy Color and displayed a significantly larger range of colors than their predecessors. The Game Boy Color's screen could display up to 56 colors simultaneously from a palette of 32,000 possible colors. Gold and Silver introduced 100 new Pokémon, bringing the total roster to 251. The new creatures were designed to fit alongside the original 151 in a shared world, with much of the game's map referencing locations from the original games. The second region, Johto, was presented as adjacent to the original Kanto region, and completing the main storyline of Gold and Silver allowed the player to travel back to Kanto and revisit many locations from the first games. This design decision, connecting the two game worlds within a single cartridge, required considerable memory management. The Game Boy Color cartridge for Gold and Silver contained 8 megabytes of data, a substantial amount for a handheld game cartridge of that era. The original Red and Green games contained approximately 1 megabyte of data, meaning that Gold and Silver represented roughly an 8-fold increase in data storage relative to their predecessors. Gold and Silver also introduced a real-time clock mechanic, which synchronized certain in-game events with the actual time of day as reported by the Game Boy Color's internal clock. Players were required to set the current time and date when starting a new game, and the game's systems would then track the passage of real time, affecting which Pokémon appeared at certain hours and triggering specific weekly events. The clock continued running even when the game was powered off, as long as the cartridge's internal battery remained functional. The internal battery in Game Boy cartridges was used to maintain save data, as well as, in the case of Gold and Silver, to power the real-time clock. These batteries had a finite lifespan, typically estimated at approximately 5 to 10 years under normal conditions. As original cartridges have aged, many have experienced battery failure, resulting in the loss of saved game data and the cessation of the real-time clock function. Replacement batteries can be installed through a process that involves opening the cartridge casing and soldering a new battery into place. The save data in original Pokémon games was stored in a small section of the cartridge's SRAM, or static random access memory. This memory required a continuous low-level electrical charge to retain its contents, which was supplied by the internal battery. When the battery voltage dropped below a certain threshold, the SRAM could no longer maintain its data, and the save file was erased. The data itself was not physically written to a permanent medium in the same way that more modern solid-state storage functions. Crystal version, released in Japan in December of 2000, was a third edition of the Gold and Silver generation and introduced several features that had not been present in the original pair. Among these was the option to play as a female protagonist, a first for the main series. The female character option required the creation of an alternate set of sprites for the overworld and battle entry animations, representing a modest but meaningful expansion of the game's asset library. Crystal also introduced animated battle sprites for Pokémon, with each creature displaying a brief, looping animation at the start of a battle rather than appearing as a static image. These animations were produced within the same pixel grid and color constraints as the static sprites, but required additional animation frames to be stored in the cartridge. The animations were short, typically consisting of 2 to 4 frames looping in sequence. The transition to the Game Boy Advance marked another significant change in the technical capabilities available to Pokémon's developers. The Game Boy Advance, released in Japan in March of 2001, featured a 32-bit processor, a significantly more capable display, and a wider screen format than the Game Boy Color. The screen displayed a resolution of 240 pixels wide by 160 pixels tall, a meaningful increase over the Game Boy Color's 160 by 144. Pokémon Ruby and Sapphire, released in Japan in November of 2002, were the first main series games developed for the Game Boy Advance. They introduced 135 new Pokémon, bringing the total to 386, and presented a new region called Hoenn based loosely on the Kyushu region of Japan. The games featured a new visual style that took advantage of the Game Boy Advance's expanded color and resolution capabilities. The Hoenn region was distinguished within the game world by its large proportion of water routes. More than half of the accessible areas in Ruby and Sapphire required the use of an in-game ability called Surf, which allowed a Pokémon to carry the player across bodies of water. This design choice resulted in a region that felt distinctly maritime, with many Pokémon available only in aquatic environments and several town locations accessible only via water. Ruby and Sapphire introduced a new battle mechanic involving weather conditions that could be summoned or extended through specific moves and abilities. The weather conditions included harsh sunlight, rain, sandstorm, and hail, each of which modified the power of certain move types and produced ongoing effects during battle. These conditions could also be set as the permanent background state of certain locations within the game world, requiring players to account for them when selecting which Pokémon to use in those areas. The concept of held items, first introduced in Gold and Silver, was expanded in Ruby and Sapphire with a larger variety of items available for Pokémon to carry during battle and outside of it. Some held items produced effects during battle, such as increasing the power of certain move types or restoring health points gradually. Others produced effects in the overworld, such as increasing the rate at which experience points were gained or facilitating the evolution of certain Pokémon. Evolution, the process by which a Pokémon changes into a new form, with different statistics, a new sprite, and sometimes new move options, was handled through several different mechanisms across the original generations. The most common mechanism was reaching a specific experience level, which triggered the evolution sequence at the end of a battle. Other mechanisms included the use of specific items, trading the Pokémon to another player, achieving a high friendship value with the creature, or meeting specific conditions related to time of day or location. Friendship, also called happiness in some documentation, was a numeric value between 0 and 255 that tracked the relationship between a Pokémon and its trainer. This value increased gradually through various activities, including walking with the Pokémon in the party, using certain items on it, leveling it up, and having it visit specific locations in the game world. It decreased when the Pokémon fainted in battle or was fed certain bitter-tasting items. Several Pokémon required a friendship value above a specific threshold, typically 220, before they would evolve, regardless of their experience level. The friendship mechanic was not visible to the player through a numeric display in the original games. Instead, certain non-player characters scattered throughout the game world would comment on the apparent closeness between the player and their Pokémon, using descriptive language that corresponded roughly to specific numeric ranges. A player wishing to know their Pokémon's approximate friendship value needed to seek out one of these characters and listen to their assessment. The individual values assigned to each Pokémon, which determined its potential in each of its base statistics, were also invisible to the player in the original games. These values, initially called determinant values and later referred to as individual values or IVs, were assigned randomly when a Pokémon was generated, whether through an encounter in the wild or through the receipt of an event or gift Pokémon. Each statistic had its own individual value, ranging from 0 to 15 in the original games, and from 0 to 31 in later generations. The system of effort values, which allowed Pokémon to gain additional points in specific statistics through battling particular opponents, was present in the original games in a different form than it would appear in later generations. In the original system, effort values could accumulate without limit beyond a certain point, while later games introduced explicit caps on the total number of effort values a Pokémon could hold. The revision of this system in Ruby and Sapphire standardized the effort value mechanic in a way that has remained largely consistent in subsequent generations. The nature system, introduced in Ruby and Sapphire, added a modifier to each Pokémon's statistic growth. Each Pokémon was assigned one of 25 possible natures, which determined which two statistics would be affected by a growth modifier. One statistic would receive a 10% increase to its growth, while another would receive a 10% decrease. 5 of the 25 natures produced no effect, as the statistic they increased and the statistic they decreased were the same. The names of the natures in the English version of the games were descriptive adjectives such as adamant, modest, timid, jolly, and hasty. Each name was selected to suggest the personality trait the nature was meant to represent, with some consistency between the flavor text associated with each nature and the statistical effects it produced. A nature described as adamant, for instance, increased the attack statistic while decreasing the special attack statistic. The ability system was also introduced in Ruby and Sapphire, assigning each Pokémon species 1 or 2 possible passive abilities that produced effects during battle or in the overworld. Each individual Pokémon received one of its species' possible abilities upon being generated. The ability a Pokémon possessed could not be changed through normal gameplay in the original implementation of the system and remained fixed for the lifetime of that individual Pokémon. Abilities could produce a wide variety of effects. Some abilities increased the power of certain move types. Others altered how the Pokémon was affected by weather conditions. Some produced effects when the Pokémon entered battle, and others produced effects when it was hit by specific types of moves. The Levitate ability, for instance, made a Pokémon immune to ground-type moves, which would ordinarily affect all Pokémon not of the flying type. Several Pokémon that were thematically connected to floating or hovering were assigned this ability. The Fire Red and Leaf Green games, released in Japan in January of 2004, were remakes of the original Red and Green games built on the Game Boy Advance hardware. They retained the story and map structure of the originals while updating the visual presentation, adding the ability system, and including various quality of life features that had been introduced in intervening generations. The games were bundled with a wireless adapter accessory in certain regional releases, allowing 2 players to trade and battle without a physical link cable. The link cable had been the standard method of connecting 2 Game Boy units for trading and battling since the original games. It was a physical cable with a proprietary connector that plugged into a port on each Game Boy, establishing a wired data connection. The connection speed was sufficient for the relatively small amounts of data involved in trading a single Pokémon or executing battle commands, though the physical nature of the connection required both players to be in close proximity. Trading Pokémon between players was a central design element of the franchise from its inception. Certain Pokémon were available only in one version of the paired games released for each generation, requiring players to trade with someone who owned the opposite version in order to complete their in-game encyclopedia. Additional Pokémon could only evolve when traded, creating a further incentive for players to engage in the trading mechanic. The necessity of trading to achieve certain evolutions meant that a player without access to another game owner could not obtain certain evolved forms through gameplay alone. The trade evolution mechanic applied to a set of Pokémon in the original games, including creatures that would become known as Gengar, Alakazam, Machamp, and Golem. Each of these Pokémon was the final evolved form of a 3-stage line that could not complete its evolution without being traded to another player. In some cases, a held item was also required before the trade would trigger the evolution, a condition introduced in later generations that added additional variety to the trade evolution system. The Diamond and Pearl games, released in Japan in September of 2006, introduced the 4th generation of Pokémon to the main series. These games were developed for the Nintendo DS, a dual-screen handheld device that had launched in Japan in December of 2004. The Nintendo DS featured 2 separate screens, with the lower screen incorporating a touch-sensitive surface that allowed interaction using a stylus or a finger. Pokémon Diamond and Pearl made limited use of the touchscreen, primarily for navigating the in-game interface. The Nintendo DS also featured wireless networking capability that allowed communication between multiple units without a physical cable. This wireless functionality replaced the link cable for local trading and battling in Diamond and Pearl and subsequent generations. The system required 2 DS units to be in proximity, typically within approximately 10 meters of one another, to establish a stable local wireless connection. The global trade system, introduced in Diamond and Pearl, extended trading beyond local wireless by allowing players to connect to an online server and post Pokémon for trade with other players anywhere in the world. A player could deposit a Pokémon they wish to trade and specify the species and conditions of the Pokémon they wish to receive in return. Other players could then browse available deposits and complete trades that match their available Pokémon against the requested conditions. The global trade system servers operated by Nintendo required an internet connection and a Nintendo Wi-Fi connection account. These servers were active for several years following the launch of Diamond and Pearl, but were eventually shut down in May of 2014 when Nintendo discontinued the Nintendo Wi-Fi connection service for the DS and Wii platforms. Following the shutdown, trades through the original global trade system interface were no longer possible, though subsequent games introduced replacement online trading systems through different technical infrastructure. Diamond and Pearl introduced 107 new Pokémon, bringing the total roster to 493. The Sinnoh region in which these games were set was based loosely on the Hokkaido region of northern Japan, reflected in its landscape of snowy mountains, cold roots, and an overall climate presented as cooler than previous regions. Several Pokémon native to Sinnoh were designed with visual references to cold weather environments, including fur-covered forms and creatures associated with ice and snow. Platinum, released in Japan in September of 2008, was the 3rd edition of the 4th generation and introduced the Distortion World, an area with unusual visual design that presented an environment with altered gravity and spatial orientation. This area was the setting for the climactic encounter with a legendary Pokémon named Giratina in its alternate form, and its design required the development team to produce environments that appeared visually distinct from any previous area in the series. Heart Gold and Soul Silver, released in Japan in September of 2009, were remakes of the Gold and Silver games built for the Nintendo DS. These games were notable for a feature that allowed the first Pokémon in the player's party to follow behind the player character on the overworld map. This following mechanic required every Pokémon in the game to have an overworld sprite created for it, representing a considerable quantity of sprite work given that the total roster at that time numbered 493 species. The following Pokémon feature allowed the player to interact with their lead Pokémon by pressing a button when facing it, triggering a brief dialogue message from the Pokémon that varied based on its current happiness value and the conditions of the surrounding environment. Pokémon en routes with rain, for instance, might express a different sentiment than they would in sunny conditions. The range of possible messages was finite, with specific messages associated with particular ranges of happiness values and environmental states. The fifth generation of Pokémon arrived with the release of Black and White in Japan on September 18th, 2010. These games were released exclusively for the Nintendo DS despite the Nintendo 3DS launching the following year, a decision that allowed the games to reach the largest possible installed base. Black and White introduced 156 new Pokémon, the largest single-generation addition to the roster since the original games, and made the unusual design decision to restrict the available Pokémon during the main story to only the new additions, presenting the full roster of previous species only after the main storyline was completed. This decision was described in developer interviews as an attempt to replicate the sense of discovery experienced by players of the original games who encountered all available Pokémon for the first time in a single playthrough. Whether it succeeded in this aim was a matter of considerable discussion in the player community at the time, with some players appreciating the fresh encounter with an entirely new roster and others expressing a preference for access to previously familiar species. Black and White were the first main series games to feature fully animated battle sprites, with each Pokémon displaying a continuous, looping animation throughout the battle rather than only at the opening moment. This required a significantly larger set of animation data than previous games and contributed to a larger data footprint for the games overall. The visual presentation of battles in Black and White was described at the time as the most technically sophisticated the series had produced on handheld hardware. The Unova region, the setting for Black and White, was based loosely on the northeastern United States, with the central city of the region bearing a notable visual resemblance to Lower Manhattan. This represented a departure from the series' previous pattern of basing regions on Japanese geography and was acknowledged in developer commentary as an intentional choice to present a more cosmopolitan and urban setting. Unova's map was structured differently from previous regions, with a more linear path through the main story and less immediately accessible exploration. Black 2 and White 2, released in Japan on June 23, 2012, were direct sequels to Black and White within the same region, a structure that had not previously been used in the main series. Previous third editions had revisited the same events as their paired predecessors, while Black 2 and White 2 were set 2 years after the events of Black and White and featured entirely new areas within the Unova region alongside revised versions of areas from the originals. The games were released as a pair with differences in available Pokémon and certain story elements between the two versions. The Pokémon World Tournament, a facility in Black 2 and White 2, allowed the player to battle against simulated versions of gym leaders and champions from all previous regions of the series. This required the creation of trainer data for every gym leader and champion from generations 1 through 5, each with an appropriate team of Pokémon and a battle theme derived from the musical tradition of their original region. The facility was primarily aimed at players who had completed the main story and sought additional challenging content. The Nintendo 3DS was the platform for the 6th generation of Pokémon, beginning with X and Y, released globally on October 12, 2013. This was the first time a main series Pokémon game was released simultaneously across all major territories, eliminating the regional gaps of weeks or months that had characterized previous releases. The decision to pursue a global simultaneous launch required considerable logistical coordination across multiple localization teams and distribution networks. X and Y transitioned the main series from two-dimensional sprites to three-dimensional polygon models for all Pokémon and trainer characters. This required every Pokémon in the complete roster to be modeled in 3 dimensions, a substantial technical undertaking. Each model needed to be rigged for animation, with idle animations, attack animations, and flinch animations created for all 918 unique Pokémon forms that existed at the time of development. The shift to three-dimensional models affected the visual presentation of battles significantly. Battles in X and Y featured camera movements and angle changes during attack animations that were not possible in the flat, sprite-based presentation of previous games. The camera could now move around the battle space to present different perspectives during particular moves, and the lighting conditions in battle could shift to reflect specific visual effects. X and Y introduced Mega Evolution, a temporary transformation available to certain Pokémon during battle when specific conditions were met. The transformation required the player's character to hold a keystone accessory and the Pokémon to hold a corresponding Megastone item. When both conditions were satisfied, the player could trigger the Mega Evolution once per battle during their turn, transforming the Pokémon into an alternate form with modified statistics, sometimes a new ability, and occasionally a different type combination. 46 Pokémon were capable of Mega Evolution at the time of X and Y's release, each requiring a unique Megastone item. Several Pokémon had access to 2 different Mega forms, available through different Megastone items. The design of Mega Evolved forms was intended to represent the peak of a Pokémon's physical capability, and their visual designs generally incorporated more dramatic or elaborate features than the base forms. The Kalos region, setting for X and Y, was based on France, with the central city bearing a recognizable similarity to Paris, including a landmark structure analogous to the Eiffel Tower. The region's name was derived from the Greek word for beauty, which reflected the thematic emphasis on aesthetic elegance that characterized several of the region's Pokémon designs and story elements. Several new fairy-type Pokémon were introduced as part of a systematic expansion of the type chart. The fairy type was introduced in X and Y as the 18th Pokémon type. The first new type since Dark and Steel were introduced in Gold and Silver. The fairy type was super effective against Dragon, Dark, and Fighting types and was immune to Dragon-type moves. It was weak to Poison and Steel types. The addition of a new type required revisions to the type effectiveness chart and affected the strategic considerations of battles involving any Pokémon of the new type. Several previously existing Pokémon were reclassified to include the fairy type as part of the X and Y update. Clefairy, for instance, had been classified as a normal type from the original games and was reclassified as a fairy type in X and Y. This reclassification affected how those Pokémon interacted with the type effectiveness system and altered the strategic profile of existing species without requiring their designs to change. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, released in November of 2014, were remakes of Ruby and Sapphire built for the Nintendo 3DS. Like the X and Y games, they use three-dimensional polygon models for Pokémon and characters. They introduced the DexNav feature, which allowed players to search for specific Pokémon in particular locations and track the characteristics of the Pokémon they had encountered there. Pokémon found through repeated DexNav use in a specific location had an increasing chance of possessing their hidden ability, a higher level of individual values, or knowledge of moves they would not typically learn. The hidden ability system had been introduced in black and white as a third possible ability for each Pokémon species, typically unavailable through normal gameplay and obtainable only through specific events or mechanics. In Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, the DexNav provided a regular in-game method for obtaining Pokémon with their hidden abilities, making these previously rare variants more accessible to players who engaged with the mechanic consistently. Sun and Moon, released in Japan on November the 18th, 2016, were the first main series games set in a region based on Hawaii. The Alola region consisted of 4 main islands and 1 artificial island, with each island serving as the setting for a distinct portion of the game's main story. The island structure replaced the traditional model of a continuous landmass connected by routes, presenting instead a series of separate areas linked by ferry travel. Sun and Moon replaced the gym structure of previous games with a trial system in which players completed challenges on each island before facing a totem Pokémon, a specially strengthened version of a specific species, followed by a grand trial against each island's kahuna. The structure of these challenges varied more widely than the traditional gym format, with some trials involving environmental navigation and others involving specific battle conditions rather than straightforward trainer battles. Regional variants, introduced in Sun and Moon, presented alternate forms of Pokémon from previous generations that had adapted to the conditions of the Alola region. These forms featured different type combinations and visual designs from the original forms of the same species, representing the evolutionary divergence that might occur in an isolated island environment over many generations. 18 Pokémon species were given Alolan forms at launch, with new evolutions added for some of them. The Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon games, released in November of 2017, were expanded editions of Sun and Moon for the Nintendo 3DS and represented the final main series games developed for that hardware platform. They introduced additional story content, new Pokémon forms, and the Ultra Warp Ride feature, which allowed players to travel through dimensional rifts to encounter Pokémon from previous generations, including several legendary Pokémon that had not previously been available in Sun or Moon. Pokémon Go, a mobile application released in July of 2016, introduced a location-based gameplay model using the GPS and camera functions of smartphones. Players moved through real-world locations to find and catch Pokémon overlaid on a camera view of their surroundings, visited real-world landmarks that served as Pokéstops and gyms within the application, and participated in cooperative raid battles against powerful Pokémon at designated locations. The application became a significant cultural event at launch, attracting players who had not previously engaged with the main series games. The Pokémon Go system tracked player movement using GPS data to award in-game currency called Stardust and Candy for each Pokémon species. Candy was specific to each Pokémon's evolutionary line and was used to power up or evolve Pokémon within the application. Stardust was used in conjunction with Candy during the power-up process. The rate at which candy accumulated from walking varied depending on which Pokémon was designated as the player's buddy, with some species requiring longer walking distances to produce a single candy reward. The application underwent numerous updates over the years following its launch, adding new generations of Pokémon, new gameplay systems including trainer battles, a friends system that allowed gift exchanges between players who shared their trainer codes, and remote raid participation that removed the requirement to be physically present at the gym where a raid was occurring. Each major update was accompanied by documentation outlining the changes in the form of release notes published to the application's official channels. Pokémon, Let's Go, Pikachu, and Let's Go, Eevee. Released on the Nintendo Switch in November of 2018, blended elements of Pokémon Go's catching mechanics with the structure of a main series game set in the Kanto region. Wild Pokémon encounters were handled through a simplified throwing mechanic rather than the traditional battle-based capture system, and a connectivity feature allowed players to transfer Pokémon from Pokémon Go into the Let's Go games. The games were developed with an accessible design intended to welcome players familiar with Pokémon Go into the traditional game structure. Sword and Shield, released on November 15th, 2019, were the first main series Pokémon games released on a home console system rather than a handheld device, appearing on the Nintendo Switch, which served as both a home console and a handheld depending on how it was configured. The games were set in the Galar region, based on Great Britain, with the landscape incorporating references to the English countryside, Scottish Highlands, and London landmarks in the form of an industrial city and a large stadium area. The Wild Area, a feature introduced in Sword and Shield, presented an open-world section of the game in which the player could see Pokémon moving in the environment before encountering them. The weather varied dynamically and affected which Pokémon appeared, and the camera was controlled freely by the player rather than following a fixed path. The Wild Area connected several towns in the central portion of the game's map and was intended to suggest the kind of expansive exploration that a more open game format would offer. Dynamax was the battle mechanic introduced in Sword and Shield, allowing Pokémon in the Galar region to grow to enormous size during battle under specific conditions. Dynamaxed Pokémon had their moves replaced by powered-up variants called Max Moves, received additional hit points through a temporary shield, and remained in the Dynamax state for 3 turns before returning to their normal size. The visual design of the Dynamax state involved a red-tinted energy field surrounding the enlarged Pokémon. Max Raid battles, also introduced in Sword and Shield, were a cooperative multiplayer format in which up to 4 players worked together to defeat a single Dynamaxed Pokémon in a Pokémon den located in the Wild Area. The Raid Pokémon was controlled by the game and used a fixed set of attack patterns across several turns, while the participating players took turns attacking it with their own Pokémon. Successfully completing a Max Raid battle rewarded all participants with items and an opportunity to catch the Dynamaxed Pokémon. The expansion pass for Sword and Shield, released in 2 parts in 2020, introduced 2 new areas, the Isle of Armor and the Crown Tundra. These areas expanded the available map significantly and introduced new legendary Pokémon, new gameplay mechanics, and new facilities. The Crown Tundra portion of the expansion pass reintroduced many legendary Pokémon from previous generations through a feature called Dynamax Adventures, in which players traveled through a procedurally selected sequence of encounters culminating in a legendary Pokémon encounter. Pokémon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl, released in November of 2021, were remakes of the Diamond and Pearl games developed by ILCA, a studio separate from Game Freak, working under the Pokémon Company's supervision. This was the first time a main series Pokémon game had been developed primarily by a studio other than Game Freak. The games retained the map structure and story of the originals and presented an art style that preserved the proportional look of the original Nintendo DS sprites in a 3-dimensional environment. Pokémon Legends, Arceus, released in January of 2022, took place in a historical version of the Sinnoh region referred to as the Hisui region and presented a significantly different gameplay structure from any previous main series title. Players navigated a series of open areas, could observe and sneak up on Pokémon in the environment before initiating captures, and could throw Pokéballs directly at Pokémon without first weakening them in battle. The game emphasized a sense of historical discovery, presenting the player as among the first researchers to systematically document the Pokémon of the region. Scarlet and Violet, released in November of 2022, were the first fully open-world main series Pokémon games, allowing players to traverse the entire map of the Paldea region without a prescribed order of progression from the earliest stages of the game. 3 separate storylines were available, and the player could pursue them in any combination and at any pace. The games were developed for the Nintendo Switch and represented the most technically ambitious open-world environment the main series had attempted. The Paldea region in Scarlet and Violet was based loosely on the Iberian Peninsula, incorporating visual references to Spanish and Portuguese architecture and landscapes. The central city featured a large circular building described within the game's story as a school, and much of the narrative was structured around the player's enrollment and activities as a student. Legendary Pokémon in Scarlet and Violet served as rideable mounts from early in the game, providing the player's primary means of traversing the open world quickly. The Pokémon trading card game was first released in Japan in October of 1996, approximately 8 months after the original Red and Green video games. The card game was developed by Media Factory and published in collaboration with Nintendo. The original card set contained 102 cards representing 60 different Pokémon species, alongside trainer cards and energy cards necessary for gameplay. The card designs used artwork commissioned from multiple illustrators, with different artists contributing designs that reflected their individual styles within a shared visual framework. The English language version of the Pokémon trading card game was released in North America in December of 1998, distributed by Wizards of the Coast, a company known primarily for their work on Magic: The Gathering. Wizards of the Coast handled the North American distribution of the card game until 2003, when the Pokémon Company took over distribution and publishing through their own subsidiary. The transition involved a change in the card design, copyright line formatting, and quality control processes. Copyright lines on Pokémon trading card game cards follow a specific format that has been revised several times across the decades of the game's publication. These copyright lines appear at the bottom of each card and typically include the year of the card's copyright, the name of the copyright holder, and in some periods, the names of additional rights holders. Collectors and researchers use these copyright lines, along with other printing details, to identify the edition and printing origin of specific cards. The rarity of cards in the Pokémon trading card game is indicated by a symbol in the lower right corner of each card. A circle indicates a common card, a diamond indicates an uncommon card, and a star indicates a rare card. Additional rarity tiers have been introduced over the course of the card game's history, including designations for holofoil rare cards, ultra rare cards, secret rare cards, and various higher tier classifications that have become increasingly elaborate in recent years. Holofoil cards, commonly called holos, feature a reflective foil treatment on the illustration area of the card that produces a shifting, iridescent appearance when viewed at different angles. The foil treatment is applied during the printing process using a separate foil layer that is registered to the card's printed design. The quality and pattern of the foil treatment has varied across different print runs and product lines, and collectors have documented numerous distinct foil patterns associated with different editions of the card game. The set symbol on each Pokémon trading card game card indicates which product set the card belongs to. These symbols have been designed for every set released since the card game's introduction and range from simple geometric shapes in the early sets to more elaborate thematic designs in later sets. The set symbol is used alongside the card number and rarity symbol to identify the specific edition of a card, as the same Pokémon may appear in multiple different sets with different artworks, statistics, or card effects. Card numbers on Pokémon trading card game cards are formatted as the card's number within the set, followed by the total number of cards in the set, separated by a slash. A card labeled 52 out of 102, for instance, is the 52nd card in a set of 102. Cards designated as secret rares typically carry numbers higher than the total set number, indicating their status as cards outside the main numbered series. A set of 100 cards might include secret rare cards numbered 101 or higher. The main series video games and the trading card game have maintained a continuous parallel development since the card game's inception, with new Pokémon introduced in video games, generally appearing in card form within 1 to 2 years of the video game release. The card game sometimes introduces card versions of new Pokémon before or alongside the video game launch, particularly for major events and expansions aligned with new game releases. The two product lines are managed separately, but coordinated at the level of the Pokémon Company, which oversees both. The Pokémon anime series began broadcasting in Japan on April 1st, 1997, approximately 13 months after the launch of the original video games. The series followed a character named Ash Ketchum, known in Japan as Satoshi, and his partner Pokémon Pikachu across a journey through multiple regions that expanded with each new generation of games. The anime ran continuously for approximately 25 years, with Ash as the protagonist, concluding his storyline in a series of episodes that aired in early 2023. Ash's journey through the original Kanto region formed the basis of the first series of the anime. This series consisted of approximately 82 episodes and a feature film released in July of 1998 in Japan and in November of 1999 in North America. The film, titled Mewtwo Strikes Back, featured the legendary Pokémon Mewtwo as its central antagonist and presented a narrative concerned with questions of origin, purpose, and the nature of being created rather than born. The English dubbing of the original anime was handled by 4Kids Entertainment, a company that also licensed and distributed the trading card game and merchandise in North America during the late 1990s. The dubbing process involved translating scripts, recasting voice roles with English-speaking actors, editing certain visual elements considered inappropriate for younger audiences, and replacing background music with newly composed tracks. The extent of these edits and the decisions made during the dubbing process have been the subject of considerable discussion and documentation among fans of both the original and dubbed versions. The theme song composed for the English dub of the original anime, commonly referred to simply as the Pokémon theme, was written and performed specifically for the North American release. It differs substantially from the theme used in the original Japanese broadcast, which was a song called Mezase Pokémon Master, translating approximately to aim to be a Pokémon Master. Both songs became significant cultural artifacts associated with the franchise and have been referenced, remixed, and performed at various events and occasions over the subsequent decades. The voice of Pikachu in the anime has been provided by a single voice actress in Japan, Ikue Otani, since the character's introduction in 1997. Otani has continued in this role across all subsequent series and films, representing an unusually long, continuous association between a voice performer and a single character role in mainstream animation. The character Pikachu speaks primarily using variations of its own name, with the emotional content of each vocalization conveyed through tone and context rather than specific words. The movies associated with the Pokémon anime have been released annually or biannually in Japan since 1998 and have covered a wide range of narrative formats and visual styles. Early films were traditionally animated in the same style as the television series, while later productions have incorporated different animation techniques and in some cases shifted to computer-generated imagery. The 20-second theatrical film, released in 2019, was a live-action computer-generated production titled Detective Pikachu, based on a video game spin-off of the same name. Detective Pikachu, the video game, was released in Japan in February of 2016 and in North America and Europe in 2018. It was a mystery adventure game in which the player worked alongside a talking Pikachu with an unusual personality and investigative inclinations to solve a series of cases in a city setting. The game introduced a narrative presentation of Pokémon coexisting with humans in urban environments at a level of detail and normality not typically presented in the main series games. Pokémon centers, the retail and experience locations operated by the Pokémon Company in Japan, began with a single location in Tokyo's Nihonbashi district in 1998. The locations serve as combination retail stores, event spaces, and demonstration areas featuring extensive merchandise selections, exclusive products, and periodic special installations related to current promotions or game releases. The number of Pokémon Center locations in Japan has expanded over the decades, with stores opening in cities including Osaka, Nagoya, Fukuoka, Sapporo, and numerous others. The merchandise available at Pokémon Center locations includes plush toys, stationery, clothing, accessories, tabletop items, and a variety of other product categories, all featuring Pokémon branding or imagery. Certain items are produced exclusively for specific Pokémon Center locations or for specific time periods, creating a category of location-exclusive and time-limited merchandise that is of particular interest to collectors. The production runs for exclusive items are finite, and once a product sells out, it is not restocked, increasing the perceived value of remaining examples over time. The Pokémon Center online store, launched as a supplement to physical locations, provides access to some Pokémon Center merchandise for customers who are not able to visit physical locations. The selection available through the online store differs from the complete in-store selection, with some exclusive items available only at physical locations. International shipping options have been available through certain third-party services for customers outside Japan, though the Pokémon Center online store itself has operated primarily as a domestic Japanese service. The international expansion of the Pokémon franchise extended to dedicated retail experiences in North America with the opening of a Pokémon Center New York in 2000, located in the Rockefeller Center area of Manhattan. This location operated until 2005, when it was rebranded as a Nintendo World Store, which has since been further rebranded as Nintendo New York. The merchandise and experience associated with the Pokémon brand were subsequently distributed through other retail channels in North America rather than a dedicated, standalone location. The competitive scene for the main series Pokémon video games has operated through various organized structures since the early years of the franchise. The Pokémon Video Game Championships, administered by the Pokémon Company International, organize regional, national, and international tournaments following standardized rule sets that specify which Pokémon are permitted and what format battles follow. The most prominent of these formats at any given time is typically the VGC format, which uses doubles battles in which each player fields two Pokémon simultaneously, rather than the single battles that form the default structure of the main series games. The doubles battle format requires different strategic considerations than singles battles, as two Pokémon can be affected by moves simultaneously, and the interaction between a player's own two Pokémon becomes a significant factor. Moves that hit all Pokémon on the field, or that have specific interactions with a partner Pokémon, take on additional relevance in the doubles format. Team building for doubles tournaments involves considering not only the individual strengths and weaknesses of each Pokémon, but also the combinations and support relationships between them. The rule set for official video game championship events changes each season, with the Pokémon Company International publishing updated rules at the start of each competitive season. These rules specify the generation of games being used, the pool of permitted Pokémon, any restrictions on items or moves, and the specific format of battles. Players competing in sanctioned events are expected to build teams that comply with the current season's rules, which may differ significantly from the rules of previous seasons. Legendary Pokémon, which are typically powerful single-instance species central to the main story of their respective games, are subject to specific restrictions in competitive play. Some legendary Pokémon are permitted in official tournament formats, while others are designated as restricted and may only be included under specific conditions or in specific tournament series. The pool of restricted and permitted legendary Pokémon is revised with each competitive season, affecting the strategic landscape of tournament play. The base stat total of a Pokémon is the sum of its 6 individual base statistics: HP, attack, defense, special attack, special defense, and speed. This total is sometimes used as a rough indicator of a Pokémon's overall power, with higher totals generally associated with more capable Pokémon in battle. Legendary Pokémon typically have base stat totals of 600 or higher, with mythical Pokémon often having totals in the range of 600 as well, though some are lower. The distribution of base stats across the 6 statistics determines the strengths and weaknesses of a Pokémon in battle. A Pokémon with a high attack stat and low defense stat will deal substantial damage but be vulnerable to physical attacks. A Pokémon with high speed will typically act before opponents with lower speed unless modified by move priority or other factors. The interplay between these 6 statistics, multiplied by the type chart and the move selection available to each Pokémon, produces the strategic landscape of competitive battling. Move priority is a mechanic that determines the order in which moves are executed when both Pokémon would act in the same turn. Most moves have a priority value of 0, and Pokémon with higher speed stats act first when both moves share the same priority value. Certain moves have positive priority values and are executed before all moves, with lower priority values regardless of the speed comparison between the two Pokémon. The move Quick Attack, for instance, has a priority value of 1, causing it to almost always execute before standard moves. The accuracy of moves is expressed as a percentage, with 100 representing a move that never misses under normal conditions. Moves with accuracy values below 100 have a corresponding chance of failing to hit the target on any given use. The evasion of a Pokémon is a modifier that adjusts the effective accuracy of moves directed against it. Both accuracy and evasion can be modified during battle through specific moves, creating a strategic consideration around whether to use moves that lower an opponent's accuracy or raise one's own evasion. Status conditions in the main series games include both volatile and non-volatile varieties. Non-volatile status conditions, such as poison, burn, paralysis, freeze, and sleep, persist outside of battle and can be cured only by specific items or resting at a Pokémon Center. Volatile status conditions, such as confusion, flinching, and various other effects, exist only during a specific battle and clear when that battle ends. The interaction between non-volatile status conditions and specific moves or abilities forms a significant portion of competitive strategy. The burn status condition reduces the physical attack capability of the affected Pokémon by half, in addition to dealing a small amount of damage at the end of each turn. This dual effect makes burn particularly impactful against Pokémon that rely on physical attacking moves, as it reduces the damage they deal while also wearing them down over time. Certain abilities allow a Pokémon to ignore or benefit from the burn condition in atypical ways, creating interactions that experienced players account for when building teams. The poison status condition deals a fixed proportion of the affected Pokemon's maximum hit points as damage at the end of each turn. The badly poisoned variant of this condition, which can be inflicted by specific moves and items, deals increasing damage each turn rather than a fixed amount, starting at a low value and doubling each turn until it reaches a cap or the battle ends. The distinction between regular poison and badly poisoned is relevant to strategic planning, as the two conditions have different use cases and interact differently with specific abilities. The sleep status condition prevents the affected Pokémon from acting for a randomly determined number of turns, between 1 and 3 turns in most game implementations, though the specific values have varied across generations. The sleeping Pokémon can be awakened early by certain moves or abilities. The sleep condition interacts with specific moves that deal increased damage to sleeping targets, creating a strategic combination known colloquially as the sleep condition plus damage move pairing. The paralysis status condition reduces the speed of the affected Pokémon by half and causes it to occasionally fail to move during a turn at a rate of approximately 25% in most game implementations. The speed reduction is particularly significant in competitive play, as speed determines turn order, and a paralyzed Pokémon that was previously faster than its opponents may become slower, changing the dynamics of the battle considerably. The freeze status condition prevents the affected Pokémon from acting entirely, similar to sleep, but has no built-in turn counter in the main games. Instead, a frozen Pokémon has a 20% chance each turn of thawing on its own. The freeze condition can also be removed by using or being hit by certain fire-type moves. In competitive settings, the freeze condition is considered particularly disruptive due to its indefinite duration and the passive nature of its removal. The confusion volatile status condition gives the affected Pokémon a chance to hurt itself instead of executing its chosen move. When confused, the Pokémon's turn begins with a check that has historically been implemented as a 50% chance of hitting itself for a fixed amount of damage before the intended move is used. The damage dealt by a confused Pokémon hitting itself is calculated as a physical attack with a specific base power, affected by the Pokémon's attack and defense stats. The flinch volatile status condition prevents a Pokémon from acting during the turn it flinches. Flinching can only be triggered by moves that act before the flinching Pokémon would have moved, meaning a move must be executed with sufficient priority or by a faster Pokémon to cause a flinch. Several moves have a secondary chance of causing flinch, in addition to their primary effect, and certain abilities increase the frequency with which these secondary flinch effects occur. The mechanic of switching Pokémon during battle introduces a layer of strategic depth that significantly affects both the competitive and casual gameplay experience. A player may switch their active Pokémon for any Pokémon in their party at the cost of their action for that turn, allowing the incoming Pokémon to be sent out, but forfeiting the opportunity to use a move or item that turn. The outgoing Pokémon may be subject to additional effects when switching out, depending on moves or abilities the opposing Pokémon possesses. Entry hazards are a category of moves that create a persistent effect on one side of the field that affects Pokémon switching in from that side for the remainder of the battle. Stealth Rock, for instance, deals damage to any Pokémon switching into the side of the field where it is set, with the amount of damage varying based on the switching Pokémon's type interaction with the rock type. Spikes and toxic spikes create layered hazards with additional effects for each layer present on the field. The removal of entry hazards requires specific moves or abilities to clear them from the field. Rapid Spin, a normal type move, clears hazards from the user's side of the field in addition to its base damage effect. Defog, a flying type move, clears hazards from both sides of the field while also removing other field conditions. The tension between setting hazards and removing them constitutes a significant strategic dimension in competitive play, as teams are commonly designed with explicit roles for hazard setting and hazard removal. The concept of type coverage refers to the selection of moves a Pokémon carries to hit as many opposing types as possible for super effective damage. Since each battle team typically includes multiple Pokémon of different types, a single Pokémon rarely needs to cover all 18 types, but covering the most commonly encountered resistant or immune types is an important consideration when assembling a moveset. The choice between prioritizing a single type's strongest moves versus incorporating moves of multiple types is a fundamental tension in moveset building. The type chart, governing which types deal additional or reduced damage against which other types, has undergone revisions across generations. In the original games, the Ghost type dealt no damage to Psychic type Pokémon, despite a description suggesting the opposite, a bug in the game's implementation. This was corrected in subsequent games. The Poison type was originally super effective against Bug type Pokémon, and this interaction was removed in a later generation. The Ice type, which was originally immune to being frozen in the original games, was later revised so that Ice-type Pokémon could themselves be frozen. The Pokémon franchise has produced a number of significant spin-off games across its history, in addition to the main series. The Pokémon Mystery Dungeon series presents a roguelike dungeon exploration format in which the player takes on the role of a Pokémon rather than a human trainer. Pokémon Ranger presented an action game in which the player used a stylus to capture Pokémon by drawing circles around them rather than using Pokeballs. Pokémon Snap was a photography game in which the player rode through fixed route environments, photographing Pokémon encountered along the way. Pokémon Snap, originally released for the Nintendo 64 in April of 1999 in Japan, was a notable departure from the main series structure and was developed by HAL Laboratory rather than Game Freak. The game presented 63 Pokémon species across 7 stages, and the player's photographs were evaluated on a point system based on the subject Pokémon's size, position, and pose in the frame. The game became a cult favorite and received a sequel, New Pokémon Snap, released for the Nintendo Switch in April of 2021. New Pokémon Snap updated the photography format with modern graphical capability and a significantly larger roster of photographable Pokémon across 14 stages, with additional stages released as free, downloadable content after the game's launch. The behavior and positioning of Pokémon in each stage could be modified by throwing items at them or using a special illumination feature, creating conditions that would trigger specific behaviors photographable for additional points. The game required the player to photograph at each stage multiple times to discover all possible Pokémon behaviors. The Pokémon Company International, the subsidiary responsible for the franchise outside Japan, was established to manage the localization, marketing, and distribution of Pokémon products in Western territories and other international markets. The organization oversees the translation and adaptation of games, the trading card game, the anime, and merchandise into dozens of languages and coordinates promotional activities across regional markets. The complexity of managing a franchise of this scale across diverse cultural and regulatory environments represents a considerable, ongoing logistical undertaking. Localization of Pokémon games involves not only translation of text, but also the creation of names for new Pokémon and moves in each supported language. The English names of Pokémon frequently differ from their Japanese names and are often constructed as portmanteau words combining references to the Pokémon's thematic inspirations or characteristics. The naming conventions for different languages are handled by separate localization teams and sometimes produce notably different results, reflecting distinct linguistic sensibilities. Pikachu's name is one of the relatively rare cases in which the Pokemon's name is consistent across Japanese and most international versions. The name combines two Japanese onomatopoeic sounds, Pika, representing a bright flash or electric spark, and Chu, the sound associated with mice in Japanese. The consistency of this name across regions reflects a conscious decision to preserve it, given the character's status as the franchise mascot and its name recognition among audiences who had encountered it before playing the games. The franchise mascot status of Pikachu was not predetermined at the outset of the game's development. Other Pokémon were considered for prominent promotional roles, and the decision to emphasize Pikachu in marketing was influenced by multiple factors, including the character's visual appeal and its association with a specific Pikachu edition of the Game Boy Color released alongside Pokémon Yellow, a special edition of the original games in which the player's starter Pokémon was always Pikachu. Pokémon Yellow, released in Japan in September of 1998 and internationally between 1999 and 2000, was designed to align more closely with the anime series, featuring a Pikachu that followed the player character in the overworld similarly to the following mechanic, later formalized in Heart Gold and Soul Silver. In Yellow, the player could check on their Pikachu's current emotional state, which was displayed through sprite variations representing different moods. The game also allowed the player to obtain all three original starter Pokémon through in-game events rather than choosing one at the outset. The three starter Pokémon offered at the beginning of each main series game represent one of the most enduring structural features of the franchise. Each generation provides a choice between a grass type, a fire type, and a water type Pokémon at the beginning of the game, and each of these starters evolves through two stages across the course of the game. The visual design of starter Pokémon receives considerable attention, and their reveals are among the most discussed events in the franchise's promotional cycles preceding each new game launch. The base experience yield of a Pokémon is the value that determines how much experience the player's Pokémon receive when defeating that species in battle. This value is scaled by a formula that also accounts for the level difference between the player's Pokémon and the defeated opponent, and whether any experience-modifying items are held. Different species have different base experience yields, reflecting their relative difficulty and power, with evolved forms generally yielding more experience than their pre-evolved counterparts. The experience growth rate of a Pokémon determines the total amount of experience required to reach the maximum level of 100. Pokémon are assigned one of several experience growth curves, labeled with terms such as erratic, fast, medium slow, slow, and fluctuating. These curves differ in how experience requirements scale with levels, with some providing easier, early progress but steeper requirements at high levels, and others distributing the growth more evenly or more unevenly in ways that affect how quickly a Pokémon reaches its maximum capability. The maximum level in the main series games has been 100 since the original games. A Pokémon at level 100 cannot gain additional experience points or levels through standard gameplay, though it can continue to gain effort values, friendship, and other non-level based modifications. The cap of 100 levels has remained consistent across every main series generation, representing a stable structural constant in the franchise's design. The party system, which limits the number of Pokémon a player can carry with them to a maximum of 6, has also remained consistent since the original games. Additional Pokémon beyond the party limit are stored in the PC storage system, which has been a feature of every main series game. The storage system has expanded in capacity over successive generations, allowing players to accumulate larger collections of Pokémon. The bank of stored Pokémon is accessible at specific terminals in the game world, requiring a visit to a Pokémon Center or similar facility to access and modify. The Pokémon Bank, a cloud storage service introduced for the Nintendo 3DS, extended the PC storage concept to an online service that persisted independently of any specific game cartridge. Players could deposit Pokémon into the Pokémon Bank from compatible games and withdraw them to other compatible games, facilitating the transfer of Pokémon between different game titles across different hardware generations. The service was initially subscription-based, requiring a small annual fee to maintain access. Pokémon Home, a successor service launched in February of 2020, consolidated cloud storage functions for more recent games while maintaining compatibility with transfers from Pokémon Bank. The service offered both a free tier and a premium tier, with the free tier providing limited storage and the premium tier offering expanded storage capacity and additional features. Pokémon transferred from older generations through the chain of transfer services retained their original data, including any original trainer information and met locations recorded at the time of their capture. The process of transferring Pokémon between generations has been supported across successive generations with varying degrees of compatibility. Transfers from older games to newer ones are generally one-directional, with no mechanism for returning a Pokémon to the older game from which it originated. This irreversibility means that a transferred Pokémon permanently leaves the game in which it was originally captured. The Pokémon's data is converted to the format of the receiving game, with any statistics or values outside the new game's supported range adjusted accordingly. Certain Pokémon characteristics recorded in older games are preserved through transfers, even as the surrounding data formats change. The original trainer name and identification number associated with a Pokémon are recorded when it is first obtained and remain attached to that Pokémon through subsequent transfers. A Pokémon received from a trade or event retains the information about its original trainer, distinguishing it from Pokémon obtained by the current player. This distinction is relevant to certain in-game mechanics that treat traded Pokémon differently from self-caught ones, including accelerated experience gain in most generations. The met location information recorded when a Pokémon is obtained specifies the name of the in-game location where the player first encountered or received the Pokémon. This information is preserved across transfers and displayed in the Pokémon's summary screen. For Pokémon transferred from older generations to newer games where the original location does not exist, the met location may be replaced with a generic notation indicating that the Pokémon was transferred from a previous game or arrived from a different region. The Pokémon's original game information indicates which game in the series the Pokémon originated from, and this information is also displayed in the summary screen of most games. A Pokémon originally from Pokémon Red, for instance, would carry information indicating its origin even when transferred to a game released many years later. The accumulation of these historical details within a single Pokémon's data creates a kind of biographical record for individual creatures that have been maintained across multiple games and hardware generations over long periods of time. The Wonder Trade feature, introduced in Pokémon X and Y, allowed players to submit any Pokémon they possessed and receive a randomly selected Pokémon submitted by another player somewhere in the world, with neither player knowing in advance what they would receive. The feature was designed to encourage a sense of surprise and generosity, as players who sent rare or desirable Pokémon would contribute to others receiving something valuable. The Wonder Trade function was later replaced in Surprise Trade in Sword and Shield, operating on a similar principle. The GTS and related online trading functions have been used by players to facilitate the collection of version-exclusive Pokémon, event-distributed Pokémon, and Pokémon with specific characteristics that might be difficult to obtain through standard gameplay alone. The community around competitive breeding and trading has developed extensive conventions and shorthand terminology for describing Pokémon characteristics in trading negotiations, allowing players to communicate efficiently about desired characteristics, including individual values, effort values, natures, and abilities. The breeding mechanics of the main series games allow two compatible Pokémon to produce an egg when they are left together at a specific facility. The resulting Pokémon hatches at a low level and may inherit characteristics from both parents, including moves that would not normally be learned through level up, certain items, and some statistical values. The process of selectively breeding Pokémon to produce offspring with desired characteristics is a significant portion of preparation for competitive play and requires multiple breeding cycles to achieve consistent results. Egg groups determine which Pokémon are compatible as breeding partners. Pokémon in the same egg group can produce an egg together, regardless of other differences in species or type. There are 15 egg groups in the current implementation of the system, including groups based on thematic categories such as flying, fairy, dragon, bug, and others. A Pokémon designated as belonging to the undiscovered egg group cannot produce eggs regardless of its partner, as this group is used for species that do not breed in the standard manner. The hatching of an egg requires the player to travel a specific distance within the game world while the egg is in their party. The distance required varies by species and is measured in steps or in-game distance units, depending on the generation. Certain abilities carried by Pokémon in the same party as an egg can reduce the steps or distance required for hatching, accelerating the process. Once the required distance has been covered, the egg hatches at the start of the following step, producing the baby Pokémon contained within. Baby Pokémon are the pre-evolved forms of certain Pokémon species that can only be obtained through breeding or specific events. These forms were introduced in Gold and Silver as an expansion of the lore surrounding existing Pokémon, establishing that certain well-known creatures had a smaller, younger form that predated their fully evolved state. Baby Pokémon are typically unable to breed themselves, remaining in the undiscovered egg group until they evolve. The in-game friendship value required for certain friendship evolutions can be accumulated through egg incubation as well, though the mechanism differs by generation. Pokémon that hatch from eggs begin with a base friendship value that is lower than the default starting value of a newly caught wild Pokémon in most implementations. This lower starting value means that friendship evolution Pokémon hatched from eggs require additional time and interaction to reach the evolution threshold compared to the same species caught in the wild. The Pokémon franchise's approach to lore and world building has remained relatively consistent in its level of deliberate ambiguity. The in-game Pokédex entries frequently contain information that, taken literally, would describe events of considerable dramatic intensity. Descriptions of Pokémon melting opponents, wrapping prey until it stops moving, or containing enough energy to destroy specific structures appear alongside gentler descriptions of foraging behavior and habitat preference. The intended tone of these entries is a subject of ongoing discussion, with the entries generally treated as fictional flavor text within the broader context of a family-friendly franchise. The weight and height figures provided for Pokémon in the Pokédex are applied consistently within the game's systems in certain contexts. Games that have implemented a mechanics involving size or weight as a variable in move effectiveness reference these stated values when calculating outcomes. A move that deals more damage to heavier targets uses the target Pokemon's listed weight to determine the move's power tier. The consistency between the Pokédex values and the in-game mechanical values has been maintained across the series. The Pokédex itself has been redesigned visually with each new major hardware platform while maintaining its functional role as a record of encountered Pokémon. The device is presented as a handheld electronic tool given to the player character at the beginning of each game by a professor character, and the act of completing the Pokédex by obtaining all registered Pokémon has been an optional long-term goal since the original games. Completing the Pokédex typically triggers a congratulatory response from the professor character and may award a specific in-game certificate or item. Professor characters in the main series games have historically been named after trees, a convention established with Professor Oak in the original games. Subsequent games have introduced Professor Elm, Professor Birch, Professor Rowan, Professor Juniper, Professor Sycamore, Professor Kukui, Professor Magnolia, and others, maintaining the tree naming convention across regions and generations with the selection of tree names reflecting the regional character of each game's setting. The Pokémon storage system, typically accessed through a PC in each game, has been presented as a software system invented by a character named Bill in the original games and attributed to other characters in subsequent regions. Bill's Cottage in the original Kanto region contained an early computer system for Pokémon storage, and the story associated with this character included a brief narrative involving an accidental fusion with a Pokémon, resolved before the player's involvement. This small storyline represented an early example of the kind of brief side narrative that Pokémon games have continued to include alongside their main storylines. The number of Pokémon species in the complete franchise roster has grown with each new generation, and as of the most recent major releases, numbers over 1,000. The accumulation of this many distinct species over nearly 3 decades has required the development of increasingly sophisticated systems for organizing, storing, and transferring data between games and services. The management of a franchise roster of this size, with associated artwork, move data, statistics, animation data, and other associated information for each species, represents a substantial ongoing data management undertaking. Each species entry in the game data includes a substantial amount of associated information beyond the visible sprite or model. This information includes the species base statistics across 6 categories: its type or types, its available abilities, its complete list of learnable moves, and the methods by which they are learned, its Pokédex descriptions in each supported language, its height and weight values, its A groups, its base experience yield, its experience growth curve, its catch rate, its gender ratio, its base friendship value, and numerous other data points that govern how the species functions within the game's systems. The catch rate of a Pokémon species determines the probability that a thrown Pokéball will successfully capture the target Pokémon under standard conditions. Lower catch rates require more favorable conditions or more powerful Pokéball varieties to achieve reliable capture. The formula for calculating capture probability involves the target Pokémon's remaining hit points as a proportion of its maximum hit points, its catch rate value, any active status conditions, and the catch multiplier of the Pokéball type being used. This formula has been refined across generations, but maintains the same general structure. Pokéball varieties with higher catch multipliers have been introduced across successive generations, offering improved capture rates under specific conditions or against specific Pokémon types. The Ultra Ball offers a uniformly higher catch multiplier than the standard Pokéball. The Net Ball offers an elevated multiplier against Water-type and Bug-type Pokémon. The Timer Ball's multiplier increases with each turn that passes in the battle, rewarding patience in long encounters. The Dusk Ball offers an elevated multiplier in dark locations and during nighttime hours. Each ball type was designed with a specific use case in mind, encouraging players to carry multiple varieties. The Master Ball, present in every main series generation, has a catch multiplier that guarantees capture regardless of the target Pokemon's remaining health, status, or catch rate. Players typically receive exactly one Master Ball through the course of the main story, and the decision of when to use it is a significant one given its non-renewable nature through standard gameplay. Additional Master Balls can sometimes be obtained through lottery events within the game, though these events are chance-based and not reliable sources of additional Master Balls. The legendary Pokémon that serve as the primary mascots of each paired game release are typically the most difficult to capture through standard means, having very low catch rates and no evolved forms. These creatures are often associated with the main story climax and represent the pinnacle of desirability within the game's narrative. The combination of their story importance and their low catch rates has historically made them the primary use case for the Master Ball among players who wish to guarantee their capture without the resource investment of many conventional ball types. Roaming legendary Pokémon, a feature introduced in certain generations, place a legendary Pokémon in a location that changes each time the player moves between areas of the overworld. Catching these Pokémon requires either cornering them through strategic movement or using moves that prevent the target from fleeing the battle. The low catch rates of legendary Pokémon, combined with their fleeing tendency in roaming encounters, makes these some of the most challenging captures in the series for players who do not use the Master Ball. The shiny variant of a Pokémon features an alternate color scheme from the standard presentation of that species. Shiny Pokémon were introduced in Gold and Silver, where a single Pokémon with shiny status was placed in a fixed location in the game world so as to demonstrate the feature. In subsequent games, shiny Pokémon can be encountered randomly in wild areas, with the base probability of a random encounter producing a shiny Pokémon being approximately 1 in 4,096 in most modern implementations. The probability of a wild Pokémon being shiny can be modified through certain in-game mechanics that increase the odds of shiny encounters. The Masuda method, named after composer and director Junichi Masuda, who first described it, involves breeding a Pokémon using two parent Pokémon from games set to different language regions. This cross-regional breeding increases the shiny probability of the resulting eggs to approximately 1 in 512 in most modern implementations. The shiny charm, an item obtained by completing the regional Pokédex in certain games, provides a further multiplier to shiny encounter rates. A shiny Pokémon is distinguished in battle and in the overworld by its alternate color scheme, and in most games by a brief sparkling animation that plays when it appears. The alternate colors associated with shiny status vary by species and range from subtle hue shifts to dramatic color changes. Certain shiny forms are considerably more visually striking than the standard forms and are particularly sought after by collectors. The desirability of shiny Pokémon within the player community has created an entire subculture of shiny hunting dedicated to increasing and optimizing the odds of encountering specific shiny forms. Chaining mechanics, present in various forms across several generations, allow the player to increase shiny encounter odds by engaging in an extended sequence of consecutive encounters with the same species. Breaking the chain by encountering a different species, failing to catch the target, or moving to a new area resets the accumulated bonus. The Poké-Radar, a device obtainable in Diamond and Pearl and their remakes, facilitated a chaining mechanic that allowed the shiny probability to increase significantly with each consecutive encounter in the chain. Poké-Pelago Introduced in Sun and Moon, was a facility that allowed Pokémon stored in the PC box to perform various activities passively over real time, including gathering items, discovering eggs, and training statistics. The feature allowed players to benefit from their stored Pokémon collection in a way that rewarded having a large and varied collection rather than simply accumulating creatures with no use for that excess. Activities in Poképelago were structured around resource investment and waiting periods that rewarded regular check-ins. Pokémon Amy, introduced in X and Y and succeeded by Pokémon Refresh in Sun and Moon and Camping in Sword and Shield, were interaction features that allowed the player to directly engage with their Pokémon outside of battle. These features allowed petting, feeding, and playing mini-games with Pokémon, producing an increase in friendship, and in certain versions, providing combat bonuses during battle. The integration of friendship-building mechanics into gameplay-adjacent features, rather than purely passive accumulation, represented a design trend toward making non-combat interactions feel meaningful and engaging. The Pokémon Center healing mechanic, in which all Pokémon in the player's party are restored to full health and have all status conditions removed at no cost, has remained a constant feature of the series. The Pokémon Center nurse character, who administers healing, delivers a consistent dialogue before and after the healing process, and variations of this dialogue have been translated and adapted for every language in which the games have been released. The efficiency and accessibility of Pokémon Center healing contributes to the series' general accessibility, ensuring that players can always recover from a difficult battle without resource expenditure. The system of gym badges, earned by defeating each region's gym leaders, has served as the primary metric of the player character's progression in most main series games. Each badge earned provides access to new areas of the game world by satisfying conditions placed by specific non-player characters, and in older games, badges also provided statistical bonuses to the player's Pokémon or allowed obedience from higher-level traded Pokémon. The badge-based structure creates a series of achievable milestones across the game's length, providing a sense of progress measured in discrete accomplishments. Elite Four, the 4 powerful trainers whose defeat is required before challenging the Pokémon champion, have been a structural element of the main series since the original games. The Elite Four and Champion are typically the most challenging trainers in the game's main story, with their Pokémon teams designed to test the player's knowledge of type matchups and battle strategy. Each Elite Four member specializes in a specific type or theme, creating a gauntlet that covers a range of type considerations before the final champion challenge. The champion of each region is the trainer who holds the title of the strongest trainer in that region's Pokémon League structure. Champions have varying thematic focuses across the series, with some specializing in specific types and others using eclectic teams that reflect broader strategic considerations. Cynthia, the champion of the Sinnoh region, in Diamond, Pearl, and Platinum, has been frequently cited by players and commentators as one of the most challenging champions in the series, with a team designed to cover a wide range of offensive and defensive considerations. The post-game content of main series Pokémon games typically includes additional challenges and discoveries that extend gameplay beyond the completion of the main story. This content has varied in scope across generations, ranging from relatively limited additional trainer battles and Pokémon to extensive additional storylines, battle facilities, and legendary encounters. Games considered to have substantial post-game content are often praised for their value relative to their main story length, while games with less post-game content are sometimes noted for a relative brevity of the overall experience. Battle facilities, which appear in some form in most main series games, present a format in which the player competes through a series of battles against increasingly difficult opponents using rental or owned Pokémon under specific rule sets. Formats have included the Battle Tower, Battle Frontier, Battle Subway, Battle Maison, Battle Royal, Battle Tree, Battle Tower variants, and others, each with their own structural rules and reward systems. The Battle Frontier, which appeared in Emerald, Platinum, and Heart Gold and Soul Silver, is particularly remembered for its variety of distinct facility types and the depth of challenge it provided. The Battle Tree in Sun and Moon and its equivalents in other games allow the player to encounter trainer teams controlled by other players whose data has been shared through online connectivity, creating an indirect form of player versus player competition within a single player facility structure. The trainers from other players' data appear with their actual Pokémon, moves, and strategies, providing a varied and unpredictable challenge that differs from the fixed patterns of AI-controlled opponents. This implementation creates a bridge between the single-player facility experience and the competitive play against other players. The Pokémon Colosseum and Pokémon XD Gale of Darkness games, released for the Nintendo GameCube in 2003 and 2005 respectively, presented a spin-off format set in a desert region called Ore with no traditional wild Pokémon encounters. Instead, these games centered on a mechanic called snagging, in which the player captured Pokémon belonging to opposing trainers during battle using a modified Pokeball device called the Snag Machine. The Pokémon obtained through snagging were typically corrupted in some way, requiring a purification process before they could be used normally. The purification system in Colosseum and XD involved accumulating an amount of heart gauge reduction through battles and interactions. Fully purified Pokémon could be transferred to the contemporary main series games through a connection between the GameCube and Game Boy Advance using a link cable. This transfer pathway represented one of the few mechanisms for moving Pokémon from a console game to a handheld game rather than the usual direction of transfer. Pokémon Stadium and Pokémon Stadium 2, released for the Nintendo 64 in Japan in 1999 and 2000 respectively, presented the Pokémon from the original and second generation games in three-dimensional models for the first time. These games allowed players to transfer their main series handheld game Pokémon to the Stadium game for use in three-dimensional battles using a transfer pack accessory that connected the Game Boy cartridge to the Nintendo 64 controller. The three-dimensional models developed for Stadium were notable at the time for their quality relative to the limitations of the hardware. The Pokémon from the original 151 were each modeled and animated in 3 dimensions for Stadium, a significant technical undertaking for a console released in the late 1990s. These models were distinct from the 2-dimensional sprites of the Game Boy games and represented each creature from a fixed perspective in a battle environment. The animations created for Stadium battles, including idle movement and attack animations, influenced the visual language of subsequent 3-dimensional presentations of these Pokémon. The transition to 3-dimensional models in X and Y on the Nintendo 3DS required the creation of new models for all Pokémon in the complete roster, not reusing the Stadium or GameCube-era models. The 3DS hardware and the visual aesthetic of the main series games at that point required a specific style and polygon count that differed from the older console game models. The models created for X and Y have been reused across subsequent games with refinements and additions, forming a consistent visual library that grows with each new release. The number of frames per second at which the Pokémon models are animated during battle has been a subject of discussion in player communities, with some players noting that certain animations run at lower frame rates than the underlying game. The hardware capabilities of portable systems have placed limits on animation frame rates, and the balance between visual quality and performance has been managed differently across various titles. Games running on more powerful hardware have generally achieved smoother animations for Pokémon models. The sound design of Pokémon games includes the distinctive cries used to represent each Pokémon species. These cries are brief audio clips played when a Pokémon enters battle, is selected in the Pokédex, or in certain other contexts. The original cries for the first generation of Pokémon were created using the limited audio hardware of the Game Boy and have remained associated with those specific Pokémon across subsequent games, with higher quality versions of the same or similar sounds used in games with greater audio capability. The cries of Pokémon were originally generated within the Game Boy's audio hardware, and each was stored as a set of parameters, rather than a recorded audio file, allowing the hardware to reproduce them consistently. Later games on more capable hardware used recorded audio samples and allowed for more complex and varied sounds, though the general character of each species' cry has been maintained with evolutionary refinements rather than complete replacements in most cases. The relationship between Pokémon's sound design and the wider audio tradition of the franchise has been considered carefully in the development of each game. Leitmotifs and recurring musical ideas appear across multiple games in the series, with certain thematic elements associated with specific recurring characters or narrative beats returning in updated arrangements across different titles. The use of orchestral arrangements in later games has expanded the sonic vocabulary of the franchise while maintaining continuity with the electronic origins of the music. The Pokémon franchise's music has been performed in live concert settings through the Pokémon World Orchestra and various regional orchestral performances. These concerts feature orchestrated versions of compositions from across the franchise's history, arranged for full orchestra. The performances have toured internationally and have been received as a demonstration of the musical depth accumulated across decades of game compositions. Concert programs typically span multiple generations of games, presenting arrangements from original Game Boy compositions to most recent console releases. The visual design language of the franchise has also been the subject of official art books and retrospective publications. These publications document the design process for various Pokémon generations, including concept sketches, color studies, and commentary from designers. Some of these publications have been released exclusively in Japan, while others have received international editions. The contents of these art books have been of considerable interest to players and designers seeking insight into the creative decisions behind the franchise's visual development. The official Pokémon website, operated by the Pokémon Company International in various regional versions, maintains a database of all current Pokémon species with their official artwork, basic statistics, and descriptions. This database is updated with each new generation's releases and serves as an official reference for the complete roster. The website also publishes event information, promotional materials, and news related to games, the trading card game, and other franchise products. The Pokémon Company was established in 1998 as a joint venture between Nintendo, Game Freak, and Creatures Inc., consolidating the management of the franchise under a single entity. Creatures Incorporated had been involved in Pokémon from the early stages, contributing to the trading card game's development and holding rights to certain franchise elements. The three-party ownership structure reflects the collaborative origins of the franchise across multiple organizations that contributed to its initial development. Game Freak, the primary developer of the main series games, began as a gaming magazine before transitioning to game development. The studio has remained relatively small compared to many game development companies of similar output importance. maintaining a team size that has been described in various accounts as in the range of 1 to 200 people. Despite this relatively compact size, the studio has produced one of the most commercially successful gaming franchises in history across nearly 3 decades of continuous development. The cumulative sales figures for Pokémon video games across all titles in the series have been reported in excess of 430 million units as of recent reporting periods, making it one of the highest-selling video game franchises globally. The trading card game has reported the printing and distribution of billions of cards across its decades of publication. The anime has been broadcast in dozens of countries, in dozens of languages. The franchise's cumulative economic scale across all product categories represents one of the most commercially significant entertainment properties in history. The longevity of the franchise can be attributed to multiple factors, including the consistent renewal of its core audience through each generation, the multi-product strategy that engages players through games, the trading card game, the anime, and merchandise simultaneously, and the regular introduction of new regions and Pokémon species that provide fresh experiences within a familiar structural framework. The annual or biennial rhythm of new game releases has maintained audience engagement across decades, while the franchise's cultural presence through the anime and merchandise keeps it visible to audiences who may not actively engage with the games. The Pokémon franchise has generated a substantial body of academic and analytical writing, examining it from perspectives including game design, cultural studies, linguistics, and economics. Researchers have analyzed the franchise's approach to creature design, the mechanics of its trading systems, its cultural origins and international adaptation, and its impact on children's entertainment and collecting culture. This body of analysis reflects the franchise's significance not only as an entertainment product, but as a cultural phenomenon that has shaped the habits and preferences of multiple generations of players. Player communities around the Pokémon franchise have developed extensive shared knowledge bases, wikis, databases, and research tools that document the franchise's mechanics, history, and data in granular detail. Sites documenting every aspect of the games, from complete move lists to complete location databases to the precise pixel dimensions of every sprite in every game, represent thousands of hours of collective effort and have become standard references for players seeking information. The collaborative documentation of the franchise reflects the deep engagement of its community with its details. The generation of fan content around the Pokémon franchise, including artwork, music, fiction, games, and other creative expressions, represents one of the most extensive fan creation traditions in gaming. Fan-created Pokémon, known as Fakemon, follow the visual and conceptual conventions of the official franchise to varying degrees, with some closely mimicking the style of official designs, and others departing significantly into personal interpretations. Fan games built on the Pokémon engine or inspired by the franchise's structure have been developed by enthusiast communities for decades. The relationship between the official franchise and fan creative work has been managed carefully by the Pokémon Company, which has at various times issued takedown notices for fan projects deemed to infringe on intellectual property, while allowing a significant volume of fan creative work to persist without official challenge. The boundaries of permissible fan creativity have been a subject of ongoing discussion within communities, and the selective nature of official responses to fan projects reflects the complexity of managing intellectual property in a franchise with such an extensive and engaged fan community. The official Pokémon illustrated guidebooks, published alongside games in Japan and in some international markets, provided detailed information about each region's Pokémon, trainers, and locations in a printed reference format. These guides documented type matchups, move lists, location tables, and trainer teams in a format accessible without gameplay. The production of these guides required coordination between the publisher and the game developers to ensure accuracy of information that in some cases included details about the game's systems not entirely apparent through normal play. Strategy guide publishing for video games as a practice has declined significantly from its peak period, as online resources and community knowledge bases have largely replaced printed guides as the primary reference tool for players. The Pokémon franchise was among the most guide-intensive of gaming properties during the peak of strategy guide publishing, with dedicated guides produced for each main series release and many significant spin-offs. The decline of this publishing category represents a broader shift in how players access information about games. The Pokémon anime's broadcast schedule has historically been managed carefully in relation to game releases, with story arcs timed to coincide with the promotional periods of new games. Characters and Pokémon from upcoming game releases are typically introduced in the anime during the period leading up to a game's launch, serving a promotional function while also providing narrative content for the anime's ongoing storyline. The coordination between the anime's production schedule and the game development calendar represents one of the more complex, ongoing coordination efforts in the franchise's management. The voice cast of the English dub of the Pokémon anime underwent a significant change in 2006 when the dubbing rights transferred from 4Kids Entertainment to Pokémon USA, resulting in the replacement of the original English voice cast with a new set of actors. The recasting was a subject of considerable discussion in the Western fan community, with opinions divided between those who preferred the original cast and those who adapted to or preferred the new performances. The Japanese voice cast has remained largely consistent throughout the anime's run. The merchandise licensing operations of the Pokémon franchise operate across an extensive range of product categories and manufacturing partners. Plush toys, clothing, stationery, food products, electronic accessories, home goods, and many other categories have been produced under Pokémon licensing agreements. The aesthetic consistency required for licensed products is maintained through brand guidelines that specify how Pokémon characters may be depicted, what color values are acceptable for key characters, and what level of artistic deviation from official designs is permitted. Limited edition and collaboration merchandise has been produced through partnerships with other brands and artists, creating products that merge the Pokémon aesthetic with external creative traditions. These collaborations have ranged from fashion partnerships with clothing brands to food product co-branding to art collaborations with individual illustrators. Each collaboration typically produces a finite quantity of exclusive products associated with the partnership period before returning to standard merchandise offerings. The Pokémon franchise's presence in Japan has included themed cafe experiences, branded hotel stays, and event installations that create immersive experiences beyond standard retail. Themed cafe menus based on specific Pokémon or regions available for limited periods represent a format that has proven repeatedly successful and has been replicated in various forms in multiple cities and contexts. The combination of food, merchandise, and atmosphere in these experiences creates a form of engagement that is distinct from both retail and gaming. The Pokémon franchise has commemorated significant anniversaries with dedicated events, products, and promotions. The 20th anniversary of the franchise in 2016 was observed with the re-release of the original Red and Blue games on the Nintendo 3DS Virtual Console service, allowing players who had not experienced the original games on original hardware to play the unmodified versions with minimal modern adaptation. The 25th anniversary in 2021 was similarly marked with special events, plus musical collaborations, and product releases across the franchise's multiple product lines. The Virtual Console releases of the original Pokémon games on the Nintendo 3DS preserved the original gameplay with certain accommodations for the new platform, including the use of the 3DS's wireless communication capability to facilitate trades and battles that previously required a physical link cable. The local wireless trading between Virtual Console games maintained the original generation on Pokémon limitations, though a pathway for transferring Pokémon from these Virtual Console games to Pokémon Bank and subsequently to Pokémon Home was eventually established. The preservations of older Pokémon games has become an increasingly discussed topic as original hardware and cartridges age, and as digital distribution channels for older games have been limited or discontinued. The Nintendo 3DS eShop, which provided access to Virtual Console versions of older games, was closed for new purchases in March of 2023, limiting new access to the virtual versions of older games. Questions about long-term access to older game titles are part of a broader conversation in gaming about digital game preservation and access. Physical game cartridges and discs remain functional as long as the underlying storage medium and hardware remain operational. Original Game Boy cartridges from 1996 are still functional in compatible hardware decades after their manufacture, though battery degradation can affect save functionality. The durability of physical game media relative to digital distribution, which depends on the ongoing operation of server infrastructure, represents a consideration in discussions about long-term access to historical game titles. The ROM preservation community has documented and archived original game data from historical hardware across the history of the medium, creating copies of game data that can be run in software emulators independent of original hardware. The legal and ethical dimensions of ROM preservation and emulation are complex and continue to be debated, with arguments centered on the tension between intellectual property rights and the preservation of historical digital artifacts. The Pokémon franchise's games are among the most extensively documented in ROM archives, given the franchise's scale and the dedicated nature of its community. The save states and replay features available in modern emulation software allow preservation of specific game moments and precise documentation of game events in ways not possible with original hardware. Competitive speedrunning communities have used these tools to analyze game systems in granular detail, identifying optimal routes and techniques for completing games as quickly as possible. The Pokémon speedrunning community has produced extensive documentation of the most efficient pathways through each game, including statistical analysis of random number generation and its effects on encounter and catch outcomes. Random number generation in original Game Boy Pokémon games was handled through a linear, congruential generator that produced a predictable sequence of pseudo-random numbers based on a seed value. Advanced understanding of this system has allowed speedrunners and researchers to manipulate the game state to produce desired outcomes, a technique known as RNG manipulation. The deterministic nature of pseudo-random number generation means that a precise sequence of inputs at precisely timed moments can reliably produce specific outcomes that would appear random under normal play conditions. The technical documentation of Pokémon game systems by research communities has produced detailed knowledge of the internal workings of each game, including the precise formulas used for damage calculation, experience yield, catch rate determination, and many other gameplay systems. This documentation is maintained in publicly accessible wikis and data repositories and represents a significant collective research effort. The accuracy of community documentation has been verified against official sources in some cases and against direct observation of game behavior through testing in others. The community of players who engage with Pokémon at this level of technical detail represents one end of the franchise's extraordinarily wide demographic range. At the other end are players whose engagement with the games is entirely casual, completing the main story at their own pace without optimization of statistics or strategies. The franchise's design has always been intended to support both types of engagement simultaneously, presenting a surface experience accessible to any player while containing layers of depth that reward increasingly detailed investigation. The accessibility features introduced in more recent Pokémon games reflect a deliberate effort to reduce barriers to entry for players who find certain aspects of the franchise's systems challenging. Automatic experience sharing across the entire party, rather than only for the Pokémon that participated in battle, was implemented as a standard setting in later games to reduce the time required to keep all party members at comparable levels. Simplified explanations of type matchups and move effects have been added to battle interfaces to reduce the knowledge barrier for new players. The difficulty scaling discussions around the main series games have been ongoing in player communities, with some players noting that modern games feel easier than older entries due to accumulated accessibility additions, and others appreciating the reduced frustration for newer players. The franchise has not introduced a formal difficulty selection system in the main series, though Black and White too briefly introduced an option for more challenging encounters through a key item that could be shared between players. This hard mode option was not carried forward to subsequent games. The design of rival characters in the Pokémon series has evolved considerably from the antagonistic rivals of the original games, who would mock the player's choices and challenge them aggressively, to more supportive or friendly rival archetypes that appear alongside encouraging rivals in later games. The original rival character, who could be named by the player and appeared throughout Kanto as a recurring challenge, was explicitly described in various game text as having a hostile or competitive personality. Later rival designs have varied between these approaches, with some games including both aggressive and supportive rival characters. The rival character's role in the game narrative has typically been to serve as a recurring point of comparison for the player's progress, appearing at periodic points to either challenge or acknowledge the player's development. The rival's team evolves alongside the player's journey, with the rival having obtained and trained Pokémon of incrementally increasing capability at each encounter. The starter Pokémon of the rival in games, where the rival receives a starter, is typically chosen from the species most advantageous against the player's choice. The professor characters who give the player their starter Pokémon and initial equipment are typically the player character's reference point for the overarching goal of completing the Pokédex. The assignment of this goal by an authority figure at the beginning of each game establishes the collection mechanic as an official objective rather than an optional personal project. The social framing of Pokédex completion as something encouraged by a respected researcher gives the activity narrative legitimacy within the game world. The Pokémon centers that appear in every town and city throughout each game's map are both functional healing stations and narrative locations where other characters are found and side content is sometimes accessed. The layout of Pokémon centers has been consistent across generations, with a counter at which healing is requested, a PC for accessing the storage system, and typically a trading or battle communication terminal of some kind. The architectural style of the Pokémon Center building has varied between regions while maintaining interior consistency. The gym architecture in each region reflects the character and type specialization of the gym leader within. A fire-type gym may incorporate warm lighting and heat-themed decor, while an ice-type gym might present cold colors and crystalline visual elements. The puzzles, or challenges, that must be solved to reach the gym leader within each gym typically incorporate the theme of that leader's type specialization, requiring the player to engage with the themed environment before reaching the battle itself. Gym leader teams in the main series games are designed to test the player's knowledge of specific type matchups and to present a challenge appropriate to the point in the game where the gym appears. Early gyms use lower-level Pokémon with limited move options, while later gyms use higher-level Pokémon with more complete move sets and sometimes items. The level progressions of gym leader teams creates a consistent difficulty curve across the game's main story, with each gym intended to be slightly more challenging than the last. The gym badge system has been adapted in various ways across different games in the series. In Black and White, the gym badge mechanics were maintained, but the gyms themselves were redesigned to include more elaborate puzzle structures and environmental storytelling. In Sun and Moon, the gym system was replaced entirely with the Island Challenge system, representing one of the most significant structural departures from the traditional main series format. Sword and Shield returned to a gymnasium format, though the stadiums were presented at a much larger scale, with audience members in a tournament-style presentation. The Pokémon League, the competitive organization that governs official battles and establishes the Elite Four and Champion structure within each region, operates as an in-world institution with its own administration and rules. The League certifies trainers through the gym badge system, requiring a set number of badges before a trainer may challenge the Elite Four. The specifics of the League's operation are only lightly sketched in most games, serving primarily as a narrative framework for the main story rather than a detailed institutional description. The concept of a Pokémon professor and their regional research focus provides each game with a scientific framing for the player's journey. Research agendas have included the study of Pokémon relationships with humans, the study of regional type distributions, the study of Pokémon evolution, and the study of the relationship between Pokémon and a specific environmental feature or phenomenon. This research framing gives the player character's journey a narrative purpose beyond personal achievement, positioning the Pokédex completion task as a contribution to scientific knowledge. The in-game currency of the Pokémon world, called Pokédollars or simply P, is used in shops throughout each region to purchase items including Pokéballs, healing items, and technical machines. The economy of the in-game world is relatively simple, with item prices fixed and Pokémon battles against trainers providing a set reward in Pokédollars upon defeat. The in-game economy does not model supply and demand dynamics and functions primarily as a resource management mechanic rather than an economic simulation. Technical machines, commonly called TMs, allow a Pokémon to learn a move it would not naturally acquire through level up. Each EM corresponds to a specific move and can be used on any Pokémon that is compatible with that move. In the original games, each TM could be used only once before it was consumed, making the decision of which Pokémon to teach a given TM a permanent and potentially consequential one. Beginning with Black and White, TMs were made reusable indefinitely, removing the permanence of TM usage decisions and making the mechanics significantly more forgiving. Hidden machines, called HMs, function similarly to TMs but teach moves that can be used both in battle and in the overworld to interact with environmental features. The HM move Surf allows Pokémon to traverse water. Cut removes thin trees that block paths. Fly allows travel between visited towns. Strength moves large boulders. Rock Smash breaks breakable rocks. Flash reduces cave darkness in early games. Defog clears weather and hazards in later games. The HM mechanic created a system in which certain Pokémon became valuable outside of combat specifically for their ability to use HM moves in the overworld. The HM system was phased out in Sun and Moon, replaced by a mechanic that allowed specific Pokémon associated with each island's kahuna to provide overworld traversal capabilities through a system called Ride Pokémon. This change removed the need to allocate party slots or move slots specifically for HM usage, which had been a significant constraint on team building in earlier games. Subsequent games have similarly provided overworld traversal through non-HM mechanics, effectively retiring the traditional HM system from the series. The experience point formula, used to calculate how much experience a Pokémon gains from a battle, has changed across generations. In early games, the formula included a factor based on whether the Pokémon defeated was a wild Pokémon or a trainer's Pokémon, with trainer Pokémon yielding more experience. Later games revised the formula to include additional factors, and the implementation of automatic experience sharing across the full party in recent games changed the effective experience distribution significantly. These mechanical changes have altered the pace of progression through the games. The concept of held items added a new dimension to Pokémon team management, beginning with Gold and Silver. Prior to held items, Pokémon's capabilities in battle were determined entirely by their base statistics, individual values, effort values, moves, and types. With held items, a single additional variable could significantly alter a Pokémon's effective performance in a range of situations. Competitive teams are built with careful consideration of held item selection for each team member, as items represent one of the most flexible levers available for optimizing a team's performance. The leftovers item, which restores a small percentage of the holder's maximum hit points at the end of each turn, has been one of the most consistently valuable held items across the history of competitive play. Its passive recovery effect provides a consistent benefit regardless of the battle situation, and its value scales with the holder's maximum hit points, making it particularly effective on defensive Pokémon with high HP stats. The consistent availability and general utility of leftovers has made it a staple in competitive team building across many generations. The choice items, including Choice Band, Choice Specs, and Choice Scarf, provide significant boosts to a single statistic at the cost of locking the holder into using the same move until it switches out of battle. Choice Band increases the holder's attack stat by 50%. Choice Specs increases the special attack stat by 50%. Choice Scarf increases the speed stat by 50%. The trade-off between the substantial statistical boost and the move restriction creates a strategic commitment that must be managed carefully in competitive play. Life Orb is a held item that increases the power of the holder's attacks by 30% while dealing a small amount of damage to the holder after each attack. This item provides a boost applicable to all attacking moves rather than a specific type, making it versatile but requiring the user to be durable enough to sustain the ongoing self-damage. The Life Orb's interaction with abilities that modify self-damage has been the subject of specific calculations and strategic use in competitive play. The Eviolite, an item introduced in Black and White, provides a significant boost to both defense and special defense stats when held by a Pokémon that has not yet reached its final evolved form. This item creates a strategic niche for unevolved Pokémon, allowing them to serve defensive roles in competitive contexts that would not normally reward their use. Certain Pokémon species that are viable defensively in their unevolved forms, while lacking comparable capability in their final forms, have found competitive use specifically through the Eviolite. The Assault Vest, introduced in X and Y, increases the holder's special defense stat by 50%, but prevents the holder from using moves designated as status moves. The trade-off between the defensive bonus and the restriction on status move usage creates a specific niche for the item on Pokémon that function primarily as special defensive tanks while relying entirely on attacking moves. The item's restriction interacts with many strategic options and requires careful consideration of the user's moveset before inclusion on a team. Rocky Helmet is a held item that deals a small amount of damage to any opposing Pokémon that makes physical contact with the holder. This passive damage effect rewards using the item on Pokémon that are frequently hit by contact moves, making it particularly valuable on physically defensive Pokémon who expect to absorb multiple attacks. The item's effect combines with abilities and other items that produce similar contact damage, and the cumulative chip damage can meaningfully contribute to an opponent's attrition over the course of a battle. The Shell Bell is a held item that restores a portion of the damage dealt by the holder's attacks as hit points to the holder. This passive healing effect is most valuable on Pokémon that deal large amounts of damage in single attacks, as larger damage outputs produce larger healing returns. The item provides a consistent source of recovery that does not require move slots, but is dependent on the holder actively dealing damage, making it less effective when the holder is forced into a defensive role. The mental model of damage calculation in competitive Pokémon is built around understanding how each variable contributes to the final outcome. The attacking statistic, the defending statistic, the base power of the move, the type effectiveness multiplier, the same type attack bonus when the move matches the attacker's type, any additional modifiers from abilities, weather, held items, and move properties all contribute to the final damage range. Damage in the main series games includes a random factor of approximately 15% variance, meaning the same attack can deal slightly different amounts of damage on each use. The same type attack bonus, commonly abbreviated as stab, applies when a Pokémon uses a move that matches one of its own types. This bonus increases the effective power of the move by 50% in most games, incentivizing Pokémon to use moves of their own type for maximum damage output. The presence of stabs means that a Pokémon's typing directly influences which moves it can most effectively use in an offensive capacity, making typing a fundamental determinant of offensive role. Dual-type Pokémon, which possess two types simultaneously, experience type interactions from both types when receiving damage. An attack of a type that is super effective against both of the target's types deals 4 times the standard damage, the highest damage multiplier available through type interactions in the standard type chart. Conversely, a type that is resisted by both of a dual-type Pokémon's types deals only 1/4 the standard damage. These extreme multipliers create situations where dual-type Pokémon have both very exploitable weaknesses and very strong resistances. The immunities granted by certain type combinations provide complete protection against specific types of attacks. A Ghost-type Pokémon is immune to normal and fighting-type moves. A Normal-type Pokémon is immune to Ghost-type moves. These immunities create tactical considerations around move selection and prediction in battle, as players must account for the possibility of their move failing entirely against an immune opponent. The presence of immunities has remained a consistent feature of the type chart across all generations. The Trace ability allows the Pokémon that possesses it to copy the ability of the opposing Pokémon when it enters battle. This creates a versatile Pokémon that can adapt its passive effect to match the most useful ability available from the opponent, though the Trace Pokémon must first enter battle against an opponent to determine what ability will be copied. In doubles battles, Trace copies the ability of one of the 2 opposing Pokémon, and the specific one copied follows a consistent but potentially exploitable selection process. The Protean and Libero abilities possessed by specific Pokémon species change the user's type to match the type of the move it is about to use before the move is executed. This means the user always receives the same type attack bonus on every move it uses, regardless of its original type. The ability significantly increases the offensive versatility of the Pokémon that possess it and has been a point of discussion in competitive settings regarding the balance implications of guaranteeing the stat bonus on every attack. The Intimidate ability reduces the attack stat of all opponents present when the Pokémon with Intimidate enters battle. In doubles battles, this means Intimidate reduces the attack of both opposing Pokémon simultaneously, making it particularly impactful in that format. Intimidate is one of the most frequently used abilities in competitive play across many generations due to its immediate and consistent impact on the battle's physical damage dynamics. The frequency of Intimidate use has led to the development of specific counter strategies and abilities that can negate or reverse its effect. The weather abilities that summon specific weather conditions when a Pokémon with such an ability enters battle have been central to competitive strategies across multiple generations. Drought summons harsh sunlight, Drizzle summons rain, Sandstream summons a sandstorm, Snow Warning summons hail. In earlier generations, these abilities maintained the summoned weather for the remainder of the battle, making them extremely powerful. A change implemented in X and Y reduced the duration of ability-summoned weather to 5 turns under normal conditions, or 8 turns when the summoning Pokémon holds a specific item, significantly altering the strategic importance of these abilities. The Telepathy ability prevents a Pokémon from being damaged by its allies' moves in double or triple battles, protecting it from friendly fire when an ally uses a move that would affect all Pokémon on the field. This ability has limited use in single battles, but provides meaningful protection in multi-Pokémon formats for Pokémon paired with allies that use broad-hitting moves. The protection Telepathy provides is specifically relevant in formats where moves like Earthquake, which hit all Pokémon except the user, are common and can otherwise damage friendly Pokémon unintentionally. The power of Alchemy and Receiver abilities work identically to each other, activating when an ally Pokémon faints in battle and copying that ally's ability to replace the user's own. In doubles battles, this creates strategic possibilities involving setting up a powerful ability on an ally Pokémon before allowing it to faint in a controlled manner, transferring the ability to the receiver Pokémon in order to use it more effectively. This interaction requires careful team construction and execution timing to implement successfully. The Disguise ability, exclusive to the Mimikyu species, allows the Pokémon to absorb a single hit without taking damage, as the attack instead destroys the disguise portion of the Pokémon's appearance. After the disguise is broken, subsequent attacks deal normal damage. The ability functions similarly to a free focus sash effect, guaranteeing that the Pokémon survives at least one attack, regardless of its power, and provides the Mimikyu with a reliable setup opportunity. The disguise has specific interactions with multi-hit moves and other damage-dealing mechanics that have been thoroughly documented by the competitive community. The Guerrilla Tactics ability, introduced in Sword and Shield, functions similarly to the Choice Band held item, restricting the holder to using only the move it selected on the first turn while increasing the power of its physical moves by 50%. This ability allows a Pokémon to carry a different held item while still benefiting from the boost and restriction that would ordinarily be tied to the Choice Band. The interaction between Guerrilla Tactics and items that would otherwise be restricted by Choice Band creates specific strategic options. The Galarian forms introduced in Sword and Shield extended the regional variant concept established in Sun and Moon to Pokémon from the first generation as well as from other previous generations. These forms presented different type combinations, abilities, and visual designs from the original forms of the same species, representing adaptations to the specific environmental and cultural conditions of the Galar region. The inclusion of first-generation Pokémon as Galarian forms was noted as an opportunity to revisit well-known designs with fresh concepts. The Hisuian forms introduced in Legends, Arceus extended the regional variant concept to a historical setting, presenting adaptations that existed in a particular time period, but may not have persisted into the modern game world. These forms added additional depth to the concept of regional variants by suggesting that certain Pokémon forms had existed in earlier periods and might have diverged from modern forms through subsequent generations of adaptation. The historical framing of Hisuian forms gave them a narrative context distinct from the simply geographic framing of Alolan and Galarian forms. Paldean forms, introduced in Scarlet and Violet, continued the pattern of regional variants, with forms adapted to the conditions of the Paldea region. These included Paldean forms of Pokémon from previous generations, as well as new evolutions, available only for Paldean forms of specific species, expanding the evolutionary trees of those species within the context of the new region. The availability of region-exclusive evolutions added an additional incentive for players to seek out regionally specific Pokémon forms. The concept of convergent species, also introduced in Scarlet and Violet, presented new Pokémon that were designed to resemble existing Pokémon species without being genetically related to them, representing convergent evolution as a narrative explanation for their similar appearances. These convergent species have different base statistics, types, abilities, and movesets from the Pokémon they superficially resemble, making them distinct in gameplay while acknowledging their visual similarity. The convergent species concept added a new category to the conceptual vocabulary of Pokémon biological diversity within the game world. The biology of Pokémon, as described across Pokédex entries, official game descriptions, and supplementary materials, presents a rich but internally inconsistent picture of how these creatures function. Height and weight values suggest physical properties that do not always align with behavioral descriptions or move capabilities. Some Pokémon are described as having body temperatures extreme enough to melt specific materials, while others are described as being composed of substances like gas or crystal in ways that raise questions about their physical constitution. The franchise treats these descriptions primarily as flavor elements rather than as a coherent biological framework. The mythology and cosmology suggested by the legendary Pokémon of each generation present fragments of a larger narrative framework that has evolved and expanded across the series. Early legendary Pokémon were powerful individual species with localized significance, while later generations introduced legendary Pokémon with roles in the creation or maintenance of the fundamental conditions of the game world. Dialga and Palkia, introduced in Diamond and Pearl, are associated with the concepts of time and space respectively. Arceus, also from Diamond and Pearl, is presented as a creator deity. The mythology built around these creatures has been developed and cross-referenced across multiple generations. The villain organizations that appear in each main series game typically possess a specific philosophy or goal that drives the plot conflict of that game. Team Rocket, the antagonists of the original games, sought to exploit Pokémon for profit and power. Later villain teams pursued goals ranging from ecological transformation of the game world to awakening legendary Pokémon to transcending dimensions to pursuing ideological visions for the future of the Pokémon world. Each organization was designed to reflect a specific thematic concern relevant to the game's overall narrative. The themes explored across different generations of the main series games have covered environmental concerns, the relationship between Pokémon and humans, the nature of truth and idealism, the conflict between progress and tradition, the ethics of power, and the concept of memory and legacy. These themes are explored with varying levels of directness across different games, with some presenting their thematic concerns through explicit dialogue and others embedding them in environmental storytelling and character behavior. The presence of these themes has been noted as part of what gives the franchise depth beyond its gameplay mechanics. The music composed for legendary Pokémon battles and climactic story moments represents some of the most elaborate compositional work in the franchise's musical catalog. These pieces are designed to convey the narrative weight of the encounter and the power of the creature being faced, using orchestral and electronic techniques to produce music that feels appropriately significant. Many of these compositions have become particularly beloved by fans and are frequently performed at concert events and covered by musicians in the broader game music community. The process of entering a battle with a legendary Pokémon in the main series games typically begins with a cutscene or dialogue sequence that establishes the narrative context of the encounter, followed by the battle itself with specialized music. The encounter rate with legendary Pokémon is fixed rather than random, meaning they appear at specific scripted moments rather than randomly in the overworld. If the player defeats a legendary Pokémon rather than capturing it, most games provide a mechanism for the player to encounter it again, either through a direct rematch prompt or through specific game events. The concept of Pokémon mythology within the franchise extends to non-legendary Pokémon whose Pokédex entries suggest unusual or supernatural properties. Ghost-type Pokémon in particular are frequently described with properties associated with folklore about spirits, including the ability to possess or affect humans, origins in death or tragedy, and connections to grief or longing. These descriptions create a layer of narrative depth in the franchise's world that sits alongside the lighter adventure narrative of the main games. The passage of time within the franchise's world is suggested through the relationship between legendary Pokémon and historical events referenced in game text. Ancient Wars, the appearance of legendary Pokémon in specific locations, and the construction of structures designed to harness or contain Pokémon power are referenced across Pokédex entries, non-player character dialogue, and environmental design. Those scattered references collectively suggest a history of the game world that extends far before the events of any individual game, though the details are intentionally left incomplete. The architectural and cultural design of each region reflects its geographic inspiration and adds texture to the game world beyond its mechanical structure. The buildings, clothing, and customs described through non-player character dialogue and visual design create an impression of a distinct cultural context for each region, drawing on and transforming the real-world references that inspired each setting. This cultural texture, while not deeply simulated in the game's mechanics, contributes to the sense that each region is a place with its own identity and history. The seasons mechanic introduced in Black and White changed the in-game environment on a monthly cycle, with each month corresponding to one of 4 seasons that affected the visual appearance of routes, the availability of certain Pokémon, and access to certain areas. Snow-covered routes in winter revealed paths not visible in other seasons, while certain Pokémon appeared only during specific seasons. The seasonal cycle ran continuously, regardless of whether the player was actively playing, tied to the real-world calendar month. The day and night cycle of the franchise, established in Gold and Silver and maintained through most subsequent games, creates a dynamic relationship between gameplay and the time of day. Certain Pokémon appear exclusively at night, others exclusively during the day, and some location aesthetics change with the time. The cycle encourages players to engage with the game at different times to experience its full range of content, creating a connection between the real-world passage of time and the in-game world that reinforces the franchise's interest in simulating a living environment. The Rotom Pokédex, introduced in Sun and Moon, presented the Pokédex as a device inhabited by a Rotom, a Pokémon capable of possessing electronic devices. This framing gave the Pokédex an interactive personality, with the Rotom providing commentary on Pokémon, locations, and events during the game. The integration of a Pokémon into the interface itself was a novel design choice that reinforced the game's theme of close partnership between humans and Pokémon while providing a constant companion presence through the interface rather than through the game world alone. The Pokémon Sword and Shield expansion, the Isle of Armor, introduced the Max Soup mechanic, which could grant certain eligible Pokémon the ability to Gigantamax rather than simply Dynamax. Gigantamax transformed a Pokémon not only into an enlarged form, but into a distinctly different visual shape, with new detailed visual designs for each Gigantamax eligible species. The Gigantamax forms also had access to unique moves called G-Max moves specific to each species, providing different effects from the standard max moves available to Dynamaxed Pokémon. The visual design of Gigantamax forms required the creation of distinctly new 3D models for each eligible species, as the Gigantamax transformation produces a substantially different silhouette and design rather than simply scaling up the existing model. The designs of Gigantamax forms often incorporated thematic elements connected to the Pokémon's species concept at a grander scale, with some forms incorporating environmental elements or abstract designs not present in the base form. The development of Gigantamax designs represented a significant art asset creation undertaking within the scope of the Sword and Shield project. Pokémon Legends. Arceus introduced noble Pokémon, specific individuals of certain species who had been blessed with a special power that caused them to behave aggressively and erratically. The player's goal in these encounters was not to capture the noble Pokémon through conventional battle, but to quell them using specific items thrown directly at them while avoiding their attacks. This format differed from all previous boss encounter formats in the main series and required the player to demonstrate spatial awareness and timing rather than strategic team building. The pastures in Pokémon Legends. Arceus served a function equivalent to the PC box system of other games, allowing the player to store Pokémon captured during research expeditions. The game's mechanic of releasing Pokémon from the pastures in exchange for specific items provided an additional use for excess captured Pokémon, allowing players to gain resources from their collection activity beyond the research points awarded for each capture. This exchange system encouraged more prolific catching behavior by providing tangible rewards for managing and releasing stored Pokémon. The Pokémon Scarlet and Violet games introduced the Terrastall phenomenon, a new battle mechanic in which Pokémon could transform into a crystalline Terrastall state that changed or enhanced their type for the duration. Each Pokémon has a specific Terra type that may or may not match its standard type, and during the Terrastall state, the Pokémon's type for purposes of damage calculation is replaced by its Terra type. A Pokémon whose Terra type matches one of its standard types receives an enhanced version of the same type attack bonus when Terrastallized. The variety of possible Terra types, combined with the ability to change a Pokémon's Terra type through the use of specific items called Terra Shards, created a new dimension of customization for competitive team building. A Pokémon might be assigned a Terra type that provides defensive coverage against its normal weaknesses, offensive coverage for move types it would not otherwise receive stab on, or a combination of both. The breadth of possible Terra type assignments for each species was considerable, producing a large search space of possible team configurations. The Terra Raid battle system in Scarlet and Violet presented a cooperative multiplayer format similar to max raid battles in which players battled a terrestrialized Pokémon to completion within a shared time limit. Terra raids were available at difficulty ratings from 1 to 6 stars, with higher difficulty raids featuring stronger Pokémon with more complex battle behaviors and greater health pools. 5-star and 6-star raids required efficient and capable teams to complete within the time limit, providing challenging endgame content. Special Terra raid events brought limited-time Pokémon with unique Terra types or special moves into the raid pool, creating recurring opportunities for players to obtain specific desirable Pokémon that would not normally be available. These events were broadcast through the game's online connectivity, updating the available raid pool for a limited period before returning to the standard rotation. The schedule of special raid events was communicated through official channels and generated regular community discussion around team preparation and strategy. The open-world structure of Scarlet and Violet created new patterns of player movement through the game that differed fundamentally from the linear progression of earlier titles. Players could approach the 3 storylines in any order and could encounter Pokémon and trainers of varying strength levels, depending on which direction they chose to travel from the starting point. This non-linear structure meant that different players might experience the game in substantially different orders, encountering challenges in a sequence dictated by their own choices rather than a prescribed path. The picnic feature in Scarlet and Violet allowed players to set up a resting area in the overworld where they could interact with their Pokémon party members, wash them, and make sandwiches using combinations of food ingredients. The sandwiches created through this mechanic provided temporary boosts to encounter rates for specific Pokémon types and to the rate of specific characteristics appearing on caught Pokémon. The sandwich mechanic encouraged experimentation with ingredient combinations to produce desired boost effects. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed drifting through these quiet moments, there's another video waiting on the left of your screen. Let it play while you rest. You might discover something gentle before sleep takes you.